Father Brendan Kilcoyne coming to you with The Conversation, courtesy of Immaculata Productions with John Waters. And John, I'm really grateful to you for taking the time out to be with us today.
It's a real pleasure, Brendan. Nice to meet you, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you.
Great. The reason we so much wanted to talk to you, John, is that, as I've said to you already, and at the risk of embarrassing you, I can think of very few, if any, other at the moment who can talk as well to the situation we're in here in Ireland as you can. I feel you've really, really thought about it, you've written about it, and if you don't mind me saying so, I'd say it has cost you.
It has.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a strange thing to be drawn into something that isn't kind of fashionable or even visible, and to feel compelled, even though you kind of wish somebody else would do it.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? It's a lot of a lot of things I find in life are like that.
Yeah.
That you end up doing things because nobody else seems to do them, and you know, the language of this is very difficult.
Yeah.
And people always get the wrong end of the stick.
Yes.
They don't understand really, because we kind of have tram lines of understanding.
Yeah.
That people kind of, you know, and they assume if you're saying, they listen to a little bit of what you're saying and they assume you're on that tram line.
Yes.
When in fact you're going to go off at that junction there and head off in a totally different direction.
Okay, interesting.
But it's a complicated phenomenon culturally. A lot of things in culture now are very, very complex, and the purpose of media seems to be in general to simplify them or oversimplify them. And so if you try to remind people of how complicated they are, you end up in trouble.
I suppose a question that's going to be in a lot of the minds of a lot of people listening to this, you often have about somebody like yourself who's really met his mark, is how you started. You know, what a man's beginnings are, what were his early influences. I know you've written about it, but do you mind talking to that for just a while?
If you were putting it to me like that, what made me eccentric? I would have to say that I had a very different childhood than most people. I was born into a situation that was kind of not, it was obviously in the middle of the 20th century, but it might have been in the middle of the 19th or even the 18th in some respects, because my parents, and particularly my father, were quite eccentric. They were different. They were older than me, good deal older than me. Obviously they were older than me, but they were a good deal older. My father was 50. As far as I can work out, I was conceived on my father's 50th birthday. Okay. Now that's a kind of a Columbo process of investigation that I've never been able to confirm. Obviously, it's not the kind of a thing.
Absolutely.
but that's kind of so, you know, I don't know whether I was you know, an act of celebration or consolation. Okay. And we were in a very different kind of situation, you know. Even in the middle of the 20th century, the house I was born into didn't have electricity. Yes. Didn't have running water. Yes. In the middle of a town. Yes. There was a tap up the road of the street. Sure. It was a part of an old-fashioned pump. It was attached, and we used to get our water there. My sisters don't like me talking about these things, but I take great pride in it, actually. You know? And we didn't have television, and we didn't have radio. We got the newspapers, yes. We got the Irish Independent and the Sunday Press for some reason, and the evening press. So there was a kind of a diversity, politically speaking. And my father worked very long hours. He got up at 4:30 in the morning and went out, and I was gone most of the day until about 7 at night. He was a mail car driver. But he was a very odd man in the sense that he was a highly intelligent man and with very little formal education. But he had the house, there was a big room full of books in the house. Which he'd acquired in auctions at old houses that were being sold off, and I used to plunder those as a child. And I was also, I was asthmatic, I think. They call it bronchitis in those days. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I had a very bad chest. So I spent an awful lot of my childhood at home in bed until I was about 10, reading these books. Or other books that my sister would bring home from the school library or something like that. And so it was very different, you know, and I think the only thing I can say about it is that I don't know, if everybody was like that, I probably wouldn't in any way be different. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't stand out in any way. I only stand out because the generality of the culture was already dominated by things like television. And that was kind of unifying the mindsets of everybody. When you can see that now, I think it's reached terrifying levels now.
Yeah.
Where everybody is watching the same thing at the same time,
yeah.
and have the same thought at the same time as a result.
Yeah.
And then the other aspect of that, in the context specifically that we're talking here, and there is no specific context because the context is everything also, was the church. One of the things that I was very hard about this was that our house was very primitive and embarrassing, Like we didn't have electrical appliances like cookers and things like that. And so we were all embarrassed to bring our friends home. Also, as a result, felt embarrassed to go to their houses because we couldn't reciprocate.
Okay.
So there was only one other house in the town that we could go to freely, and that was the church. And that became, in a certain sense, a kind of a second home as a child, and it was an extraordinary, palatial place by comparison. But I don't interpret the way that might be interpreted ideologically now, because once you say that, you're into another kind of short circuit.
Yeah.
To me, it was like that. It was a sign of something beautiful that was beyond, and that it belonged to me, and that I could go in there without any let or hindrance.
Yeah.
And I used to do that, and we all did really, even though we wouldn't necessarily talk about it in that way. And you would go in there and stay for like half an hour, or just kneel down or sit down and just in this quiet, and then I became an altar boy, and that was the first time I felt carpet on my knees was when I was an altar boy. And all of that wonder and mystery. It was the Latin Mass in that time, and it was absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, you got the Latin Mass?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, that's
I
interesting.
did, and I remember it was absolutely magical. The sensation that you felt in the whole thing. From the very moment that you rang the bell before, that there was something being released.
Yeah.
And I remember I didn't understand the Latin, but I had it all off by heart at the time, because I remember the sound. It was music, it wasn't just speaking. It was music. Yeah. And then when we were in the choir in the school, and we sang the High Mass, the Requiem Mass for funerals, which again was a very special kind of thing, and so that it was all that, and right at the heart of that then was this relationship, which is given to us, this relationship with Jesus, that was like, and I'm not in any way trying to trivialize or but it was almost like an elder brother. That was the imaginative zone of the relationship. Yeah. And I've often said that as a child, he was in every room that I ever was in.
Whoa.
That was my sense. He was always there,
Yeah.
And then that kind of started to go then when I became a teenager, because the culture came in, and this is very hard to kind of communicate, because people think you're making kind of judgments of a certain kind, like that you're, as it were, being moralistic maybe, or where I entered my teens, what was it again? It would be the late 60s, and that was a time of huge ferment in the world, and culturally, and the rock and roll and the Beatles and Elvis and all that stuff had been happening, and it was beginning to permeate the culture in the west of Ireland, like where I was in Castlereagh in County Roscommon, and a small town of 2,000 people. But I had a very close friend called Jerry who was very much into it. And he had all. He was watching Top of the Pops, and he'd be telling me, and he'd buy in the New Musical Express, and he'd give it to me then when he'd finished it, and he had a guitar, and I was very staid, as you can imagine, like from the description I've given. I was very kind of square. Suddenly, one day he appeared in the beginning of the summer holidays. I was sitting on the bridge in the middle of the town, and I seen this apparition coming down the street towards me, kind of an orange and yellow and all kinds of exotic colours. And it was Jerry, and I was there in this kind of plaid, I don't know what you'd call it, jacket, or black. We used to have a black jumper or a grey jumper, and he arrived in this, and it was like Jimi Hendrix had arrived, down the street. And I realised that I was going to have to get my ideas together as if I was going to survive in the coming time, because he was really putting it up to me, you know.
Yeah.
And from there, we kind of found ourselves in a new dispensation. Music and expectation and all kinds of things, which culminated in I think a kind of a fantasy that we were entering into, which was, I think, must have been new in culture in that part of the world, where we suddenly thought that we could actually escape from everything and become something great in a certain sense.
Yes.
And what happened then, you see, with those childhood things, the church and all that, was it seemed to me that there was therefore a choice was being presented to me. And that was because I think the church had a very dim view at the time of anything like that. They were kind of regarded as frivolous at best and you know, sinful and all that. And but they were very highly seductive, you know.
Yeah, sure.
I remember actually going to the cinema, and I don't know what year it was, 69 I suppose. The Beatles, Let It Be. And I was astonished by it, that if people remember the rooftop concert, you know, it just completely seduced me. And so the way I've often put it, one day I realised that I had to choose. And the way I put it, and it sounds almost blasphemous, but I had to choose between Jesus and Elvis.
You have, yeah. Okay.
And I chose Elvis. And that was a very hard moment in a way, because of that brotherly love, if you like, in those terms, you know. Yeah. But it seemed to me that the way it had been presented to me was that I couldn't have both.
Even though Elvis seemed to think you could.
He did think he did, you know, and Dylan thinks you can have both.
I think so, yeah.
And we didn't know that, you see.
No, fair enough.
That was the thing, you see, we didn't have all the information.
Could I just ask here, because an old professor I had used to talk about this a lot. He reckoned he saw it as early as the early 50s. He was a history professor, priest, he's dead now. Patrick Corish, he was an historian. But he felt the church in Ireland ran out of ideas, that there was a huge failure of imagination. And even as a young professor in Maynooth, he felt apprehension.
Yes.
Is that he knew the world, he could see the world becoming very complicated, very interesting, very dangerous.
Yes.
But that there were the same sort of formulas for dealing with it.
I think that it was imagined that it had to be avoided at all costs.
Yes.
And that there was a way around it.
Yeah.
And it would pass.
Yeah.
And if we all had kept our heads down, we wouldn't be touched by it. But of course that wasn't possible, and it didn't happen. The kind of way I felt about it, I think, was that well, he wouldn't really like any of this stuff, you know. You know, it wouldn't be his thing, and I better not tell him I'm going. You know, I'm not. I'll just slip away, and I'll wait till, as it were, he's asleep one night, and I'll go, and I'll be gone then.
Gotcha.
And he'll come to terms with it in due course. Yeah, type of thing. And that's kind of what I did. You know, I went off and I kind of cut. Not totally at first. I mean, I went through the motions, which is probably what the culture has been doing for some time. Yeah. But didn't really buy into it in the same way, because I couldn't reconcile the two. But there were other factors as well. I suppose you kind of, you know, you develop resentments. There's a lot, like, you might have a resentment against one person, which fuels the whole thing, you know. And there was a bit of that going on as well. A particular priest that I had a kind of a ding dong with, you know, and that fueled me in a certain direction. And that kind of journey went on for, I would call the journey towards freedom, defined in a certain way. Went on for a certain time, maybe 20 years. What turned me back was that I ran into trouble with drink. And I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, you know, a spiritual program. But it's not a Christian program, or it's not a Catholic program. But what it did for me was that it alerted me to something I hadn't taken in at all in any of this, which is obvious when you start to think about it, that my whole structure is derived from something, and I need to be aware of what that something is, because that something will define my destination, my origin, and my journey in between. And I started, it made me aware of the whole structural thing. And made me think differently. Because at the time, you see, I think looking back on childhood, we just thought the existence of God was obvious. It wasn't controversial.
No.
We just took it for granted, and we, in the same ways, the days of the week, or the night and the day, that was the way it was. But then in this kind of period that I was away, I was never an atheist. I never had any, doubt that there was something. Everything had to come from somewhere, to put it very simply and crudely. We'll come back to that, but it was never. I never got to that stage. But it was, whatever an agnostic is, I mean, I've said I was an agnostic, and I wrote a book once called Lapsed Agnostic then, to describe my journey back, which, as I say, started with AA. The whole God thing, you see, they said, they had this idea like that of the higher power. And their analysis is that alcoholism is a disease of the spirit, and that you come to that because you have actually done something very particular. You have replaced God in your life. You've kicked God off the throne and you've taken his place. And that gives you all of the responsibility of God, but none of the power.
Yeah. Which is inconvenient.
It's a terrible situation to be in, And there was a book written about AA early on in its existence by a German guy, and it was called Not God. And it's a very interesting title, because what it actually means is, it sounds like a bit atheistic or something, but it's actually not at all. What it is it's saying to you, the first thing you have to understand about God is that you're not him. And it's surprising like how many people haven't learned that lesson, and they don't know that they haven't learned it, and they don't know that it needs to be learned, because they don't know that that's what's happening. And that was me, because what it is that if you're not in contact with this, whatever this entity is, let's say for the moment, that God is, if you're not in contact, that means you're missing the most fundamental part of your structure. And so your whole entire relationship with reality is screwed up, because you're now dealing with everything as though it were your responsibility. And that's terrifying, because you don't have the power to deal with it at that level.
Yeah.
And you hadn't as a child.
Yeah.
You come out of childhood, you're so used to actually things being looked after for you. Yeah. Most children are, some unlucky ones are not. But so I kind of began to realize that I'd missed a whole part of I don't know, that something I didn't know about myself. I didn't know about my life. I didn't know about my structure. And I started to piece all these things together again then in my head in that way. I wondered, and I was still in that kind of frame of mind with Catholicism, and that wasn't really very open, I suppose. But AA has this thing where it says to you, you will go back. We find that they put things like this. We find that we go back to our religion of origin. Yeah. And when you think about it, that makes sense, because that's the hardware that you've got in there. Yes. And I started to explore all of those kind of things that I'd kind of glossed over before. It's very interesting. I mean, the whole thing about God, as I understand him, which is kind of a license to not believe in God if you don't. I mean, they talk about the higher power, and they say, well, it can be the light bulb.
Yeah, gotcha.
Or it can be the group.
I heard of a budgie, I think.
Yes, in the sense that it's not you. That's the most important thing, it's not you. Yeah. That it's something external, something outside. But of course, it has to be. Sure. The budgie doesn't work for very long.
No, it didn't apparently.
So that all comes down to the fact, not that it comes down to it, or comes up to the fact that we are, which is obvious, we're creatures on a journey that started, we do not know where or why or how, and we do not know where or how it will end. And that's, on those terms, is a terrifying state of being, unless you remember that you were started, for some reason, by some being, by some entity, and that it's okay. Yeah, that's okay, because that's all there is. Yes. And once I started to think about it like that, then you see, I suppose I acquired what I would call a kind of an experiential understanding of reality, based not on information or education or anything, but just on the experience of my life turning round, you know, from the alcoholism thing and other situations as well that came at me in the immediate aftermath of that, which were highly troubling situations and which would have baffled me normally, and would certainly have baffled me if I was drinking. I don't know, I wouldn't have survived them. But by applying this method, that I didn't have to be in charge of my life totally, that there were certain things, that's the method, you see. That's the one day at a time. It's not that you cling on for a day at a time, you know, just, dear Jesus, like, you know, let me survive today. It's not that really. It's that all you have to worry about is these 14, 16 hours that you're awake today. You know, and it's sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof.
Yeah.
And so you start the day by prayer, by asking for help. And they said to me, the only prayer you know is the one word, help, that'll do.
Wow.
And if you know only one word at the end of the day, and that word is thanks, that's okay. I had difficulty praying at that stage. I hadn't prayed for years. And I didn't really know what it was. I thought it, because, you know, I remember when we were kids, you know, at various devotions and all that, you'd be saying the rosary, and
yes.
you know, like I would lose count, you know, and your mind would go off.
Sure,
and you would
absolutely.
You would feel guilty then.
Yes.
All that, and I wasn't sure, and I couldn't really grasp what it was, and nobody ever really told me what it was. So, but I was doing this, you know, and taking this advice because I was going through very difficult situations, and I would do that in the morning. I did know a few prayers, the Serenity Prayer and the Our Father and things like that, but I didn't really feel that I was connected. And I was talking to this man in the fellowship one day, and he said, "Well, how do you pray?" I started explaining. I said, "Well, no, but where are you? Like, do you kneel down?" I says, "Oh no." It was a shocking idea to me. And this is very interesting. Yeah. It was shocking to me, and I didn't know why, but it was. He says, "Why not?" I said, "Well," he says, "I'm not able to kneel down." He says, "My knees won't bend." He says, "Why? Is there something wrong?" No. I said, "I bend it otherwise, but no, I can't do that." He says, "Okay." He says, "Here's what you do." He says, "Tomorrow morning when you're putting on your shoes, take one of your shoes and throw it under the bed." I said, "You'll have to go in down on your knees to get it." I says, "When you're down there, say your prayers." And there's something real in that, Brendan.
Oh, absolutely. That's a brilliant story. Yeah.
Do you see what he's doing now?
Yes.
Because he recognises it's pride.
Yeah.
It's pride, and he knows that it physically makes my knees incapable of bending for that purpose. Yeah. So you get them to bend for another purpose, and then you say, okay. And then when I did that, I realised this is actually, this might come out wrong, but this is the most powerful position I could ever be in, because I'm now in connection. I'm linked into the circuit of my existence in the correct way, because I understand the relationship with my Creator, and that's what it's about, I think. Yeah. What I realised after a while was that actually this method was actually, when I look back over a number of days, was being successful, because my life was now beginning to harmonise, and the difficulties that I had were beginning to smooth out, and I was able to cope with them on that basis, and I got through them all. Yeah. And that, I look back, and that's the evidence. I can't tell you why. Mm-hmm. I could actually short-circuit the whole thing by saying thanks be to God, but I don't have to do that, I don't think. Because you see, there's a thing that I kind of wary of, you know, and that's kind of with religious things, that people kind of short-circuit they go to the end of the equation before they go through the whole thing. Like, you can talk it into existence, but you can only live it into existence. You can't, you know, you can talk it, but it doesn't create it, it doesn't generate it. And in the granular nature of existence, that you see it, or feel it, or experience it. And it constantly has to be renewed. Yeah. Constantly.
I think C.S. Lewis at one stage said to, some Protestants don't approve of kneeling, and he was a Belfast Protestant, and there was that kind of discussion going on among people he knew. But his answer was to point out, we're physical beings. If you're going to go about pretending you're an angel, we'll get nowhere.
That's right.
We live in a body, so you pray with the body.
That's right.
Or it's not you.
That's right. In Catholic culture, this idea of adoration.
Yes.
It's something that I don't think we understand really at a cultural level, because it's not what it sounds like. Mm-hmm. It's not some big ego in the sky that needs to be,
massaged.
Yeah. It's about us. It's about the demeanor that we need to adopt because of our nature within reality. We are, human, and that requires us to be in a certain disposition, because there's so little we know. Yeah. We are virtually all ignorance. Humility is the correct disposition for such a person, for such a being. And that's not an insult. Yeah. That's just reality, the way we are in this strange dimension that we're in. Yeah. And I had a big trouble with that. I had big trouble with that because of very childish kind of egocentric ideas of kind of, authority. And because I'd been through that teenage phase and rebelling against authority figures and all that.
Is there maybe an Irish thing there as well?
There is a bit, yeah. There definitely is. I think it's maybe the English-Irish thing,
Resentment.
Yes, it's the idea of having a master or something, Yeah. And I don't think we've ever really got around that. I mean, I don't really understand some parts of it, the whole question of how you distinguish this being that we call God from other beings, and how we might imagine his personality that would actually make sense of it all. I think I'm lacking in understanding like that still. But I have a sense that that's a lack of mine, that one to be filled, rather than me deciding that that's the definitive word on the matter, and that should decide me, and I'll just walk away from the whole question because of some difficulty I have. People tell you there are all kinds of things, that they're atheists or agnostics or, I don't bother with that, Really, they're kind of saying something else, Yeah. They're saying that it doesn't fit my life now. It doesn't make sense of my life. I don't know, this is a kind of a thought that's come to me in recent times, that it's obvious in a way, but that Christianity has a particular dimension that actually makes it tricky in culture. And that is the incarnation. Yeah. Because it had to happen and did happen at a specific moment in time.
Yeah. That one Jew.
Yes.
Yep.
So it froze all of the kind of iconography at one moment. Yeah. And that's a huge problem now, because people become fixated on that and they think it archaic, and it doesn't seem plausible in this moment. People have difficulty, and I have difficulty, imagining the second coming of Jesus. Sure. Like, what would he be like in the modern world? Yeah. Would he be like he was in the pictures? Hardly. What would he say? Is it possible to imagine? I've never seen a piece of art that successfully conveyed, like a play or a book or a novel or anything like that, poem, which successfully conveyed the possibility of a conversation with Jesus in the modern world. And can you imagine, like, the idea that, what would it take if you were to, say, be in a place like this and just reading the paper or something, and there was a figure there, like maybe another seat, reading the paper or on his phone or something, and maybe he asked you what time it was or whatever, and you got into a bit of a conversation, and then at the end of that conversation, let's say skipping to the end, or at some stage in the conversation, you began to think, is this him? What would it take to trigger such a response in a person now, to make them think this could be him? Yeah. We don't go into that. No. Because we're kind of given this mythical, almost, version of the Gospel times that is beautiful, and we're immersed in it, like it's in our bones. But there's a gap between that and us, in another sense, that we can't seem to bridge.
And we forget that clearly from the Gospels, because they don't try to hide it. Some people didn't take to him. No. Long before the plot to get rid of him, he made enemies quickly. people who had seen the miracles walked away from him. There are a whole lot of dimensions to this, but we reduce them to two.
Yes.
And he can't open his mouth, but there's a heavenly choir in the background. Like, it's as if it's Jesus of Nazareth all over again, you know?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
No, he wasn't, I would say he was a fairly tough customer to be dealing with. I would say so, yeah. You know, on a daily basis. You wouldn't, you know.
You'd feel the track of his sandal on you very quickly.
You might do, because, you know, he wasn't at all this kind of lovey-dovey kind of guy that we sometimes like to, or think we like to say.
What Jordan Peterson would call low in agreeableness.
Yes, he sure was, he sure was. He was. He was not a people pleaser.
Yeah.
So this is something that I struggle with in some ways. Like Pope Benedict XVI, Ratzinger, talks about that, and he surprised me when first time I saw him talk like this. And I'm saying this as a layman because I've read into bits and pieces of theology. Yeah. We have gone on this kind of what you might call anthropocentric view of the whole thing. Then I hear somebody like Ratzinger say, well, you know, it's not like that. That isn't an adequate way of seeing the situation. God is not, we cannot define God. And God is something that is beyond our imaginations. And that, you know, these are, as it were, placebo ideas. That's not his phrase now, but they're ideas that we are able to relate to, but which are, as it were, not the thing. And it said, I think it was Augustine who said that if you describe God, then you're wrong. You know, all of that kind of thing. So that's a very hard thing because I think a lot of, in Ireland particularly, literalism and substantialism have been very central to our understanding of this. And what we've actually let go of is the literalism. And it's not of Christ in any meaningful sense. Yeah. Because we don't know, and it's a strange thing. You see, as someone who deals with words and has dealt with words all his work and life, I'm very conscious of the limits of words, because words are, at the end of the day, yes, they're all we have. They are all we have, but they're inadequate for this.
And we tend to forget the Jewish distaste for the name of God, for pronouncing it.
Yes.
In fact, a prohibition against pronouncing it, which is interesting.
Yes, there was a beautiful phrase of Father Giussani, who was the founder of Communion Liberation. He died in 2005. He said, "We use the least inadequate words." Yeah. Now that's a real challenge, to find the least inadequate words.
Yeah. To fail with a bit of dignity.
Yes, and I think, you see, the thing about language is, I actually think, and this isn't an original thought, I know that it's been said otherwise and better by others, but it's that when we're having a conversation here, and I'm telling you things, I'm not really telling you things, I'm reminding you, because what you're actually processing is the imaginative outcome of what I say for you, in my life and in your own life. Yeah. And you're putting together the two at the same time and trying to reconcile them. Yeah. So I think John Lennon said this as well, that most of the time, he says, we're sitting there and we're lying looking at the sky, and nobody feels a thing. It's the idea that most of our minds are occupied by something other than words, by space. And that in that space we can comprehend anything, or almost provided that the words help us there. Yeah. So there's a kind of a process where we have to describe. Yes. And then we jump. Yeah. There's a jump, there's a leap of understanding. And we say, yes, I know what you mean. Do you ever have that experience where somebody tell you, I know exactly what you're talking about? Suddenly
it clicks.
Yes. And you mightn't even have articulated it, but you feel it instantly. The words have triggered this. And this is something as well that, in the beginning of the Word was the Word was made flesh. That it's so vital. The Word, there's nothing else, in a way, but it's not enough. Yeah. And I think that's one of the main areas that we've fallen down in. Another serious problem in our culture is that we've built a world within the world that God built. And we think that's the world. Yeah. Again, Benedict talked about this he did an amazing speech in the Bundestag in 2011, which I call it his bunker speech. And I've written a book, which it's never been published, but it's about it really. And it's not really finished. It never really found the final couple of chapters. But it's about that man built this bunker to live in, to close out the mystery. And that gave him a total comprehension and dominion over reality, because he built it. So he knows everything about it.
Yes.
And he thinks it's reality.
Yeah.
And we all do, and we all live in it.
Yeah.
But the mystery is out there. But the mystery is also in here. That's
Yes.
the real kicker. Like.
Yeah.
That we can't escape that at all, even within the bunker.
Yeah.
The mystery is still here, simmering away. And I think that's probably the central problem with faith, spirituality, all these questions.
Would you see that work as a metaphor for the church, in the sense that the church is not an original metaphor, but the church saw itself to an extent as looking down from its battlements onto this surging chaos below, as the modern world started to lap at the edges of Ireland?
Yes.
And yet, is it Edgar Allan Poe who has that short story, The Mask of the Red Death? The plague is already inside.
Yes, that's right.
They're watching the enemy approach, but the enemy has taken over the castle behind them.
That's right. Well,
And they don't have the words to drive him out. They don't have his weapons. They can't fight him with his weapons.
the human edifice is very corruptible. And I don't necessarily mean this in the orthodox ways, but you can so easily misunderstand the whole journey, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And as soon as you do, you're gone out of a harmony that is
Yes.
absolutely essential. And you will not know it. In this bunker, you won't know it. Because you can appear to be in harmony.
Yeah.
You're out of harmony with the great outdoors, in the sense, the mystery, but you're also out of harmony with yourself.
Yeah.
And once you do, then you've lost that. It's like literally, well, metaphorically, it's like an instrument going out of key.
Yeah.
Going out of tune. You can't play anything.
Yeah.
And I think the church, the image there, yeah, it's see, I think that certainly it wouldn't be a unique idea, and I wouldn't necessarily be the most virulent advocate of it, but that the church became too obsessed with trying to control people and control their instincts and urges and all the rest of it, and contain them for their own protection. Literally, I do believe that, actually, because that's the point of it, I realise this as part of my, as it were, re-education, that all the things that I kind of had railed against or were not ordinances of man or of a being called God written out on tablets of stone even, but that they were written in here.
Yeah.
And that by breaking these rules, as it were, I was tearing myself apart. And I was creating chaos in my own existence.
Yeah.
The key to it really is the word freedom. And I used it before, that you're talking about it's a misunderstanding of freedom, fundamentally, at the very heart of it. That there are two kinds of freedom, let's say. There probably are other varieties, but there's these two very clear-cut, diametrically opposing ideas of freedom. And one is the idea of what all of that stuff that came in post-60s into Ireland and into everywhere, that it was basically, if you want to be happy, you have to do what you want, do what you feel, be yourself, be all these kind of things and they're all over our culture now. Whereas the journey that I went on was about that freedom, what I discovered was that I had misunderstood freedom. And the alcohol thing showed me that. I was never as free. When I started drinking first times, I thought that was freedom. For a long time I thought that was freedom, because I was a very inhibited kind of a youth, very shy, very withdrawn, and didn't really mix. But then suddenly, with 2 or 3 pints inside of me, I was like, and I've often said like that, it was literally like that when my mother brought me back from the hospital, she brought the wrong bottle, that if she'd brought this other stuff, I would have been a complete unit.
Yes.
It was like the kind of the grease or the oil or the fuel, the lubricant of my whole being. And because once I had it, I was
confident,
totally the person I wanted to be.
Yes.
Sort of. But you see, the trouble is, that there's a tipping point.
Yeah.
And somewhere between the second and the third point, you kind of go into something else, and then you get worse, and you go.
Yeah.
And that's the key to this kind of misunderstanding of freedom. We think that if we follow our instincts, because they make us a little bit happy in the beginning, a little bit more will make us a little bit more happy. But it's not like that. There is that tipping point, and it goes into chaos very quickly. A little bit is nice, moderation in all things, including moderation. But then, if we, and that's the key to this freedom thing, because the alternative version of freedom is something like, and this is a very approximate definition, is that it's your path. It's the path that is set out for you in the whole of time, shall we say, to follow.
Yeah.
It's ahead of you. And you don't know where it leads.
Yeah.
But you can see it's there.
Yeah.
And you can see the immediate, the first 100 yards of it or something. And that path is your life and your destination and your destiny.
Yeah.
And freedom is the ability to stay on that path and do what comes in front of you and be yourself within that.
Yeah.
And the other freedom is seducing you into the jungle.
Yes.
I think it's probably the central most significant culture and misunderstanding that we have that generates all of the chaos in our life and in society's life. Because there is these two, the path, the journey, being the true freedom, the natural instincts that we think. They need to be curtailed because that's the rule of life, that a little of something makes you feel good, a little more makes you feel terrible. There's this strange paradox, this strange imbalance in the person. It is illogical and unreasonable and all those things, but it is absolutely true. And it's at the heart of everything. Because you see, when you actually look at the culture generally now, what you realise is that generation of the 60s, who had this idea of freedom, well, why shouldn't we be able to do what we want? And that's true, you know. Well, so long as we understand that the consequences will be what they will be, that's the point. Because it won't work. And the point is, it hasn't worked, Brendan. This is the thing, that the culture is a disaster as a result of it, but they won't admit it.
Yeah.
I don't know if they even know that that's why it is. I think they've actually convinced themselves that the only reason, for example, that we're not free still is that we're doing it wrong, or we're paying too much heed to those old bearded naysayers, patriarchs or whatever it is. And if we could shake them off and shake off all the shame and all the other inhibitions, we would then be free. But of course, no, we'd be more chaotic. Things will be worse and worse. They will just get worse and worse and worse. That's inevitable. So I think, now the problem is, how do you then talk about the first kind of freedom without seeming like you're a terrible kind of naysayer? And that's the real challenge, you know. And you mentioned Jordan Pearson. I mean, he does that very well. I mean, he's very, very clear about that. To me, that's what I hear every time when I hear him. He's talking about responsibility, which is a bit of a cliche because it's a dark word, you know. Yeah. I mean, it's a necessary word, but in this context, you kind of have to. I think it's very important to tell people like that. We're talking here about your nature. Yeah. We're not talking about a set of moralisms.
There you go. Yeah.
You know, it's your nature. It's your structure.
Yeah.
You can't avoid it.
Yeah.
Without cost. It's consequences.
Yeah.
And that's what I learned really in the heart of that whole thing. You know, that with alcohol. And that spoke to me then of the whole gamut of the freedom experience that we were undergoing. What I learned there applies to everything. The anticipation of all this freedom is wonderful. Yeah. But the experience is terrible. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have freedom. See, this is the thing. And that's what Gisani talks about this, and he talks about it in precisely in the context of Christ, you know. That in a sense, that freedom, that Christ really is the freedom journey. That's how you see it. That's how in a sense, that's how, if you see Christ like that, then you see Christ in a very, very useful way, and you see him in a very real way, because he's telling us how to live this life as it actually is. Yes. And that it's not that I'm telling you this because you better, you know, whether you're a bad guy and you want to straighten out. You know, that's not the deal, really. It's you'll suffer if you don't do this like this. and everybody else will suffer, and the world will suffer.
Yeah.
But forget the suffering. If you do it like this, everything will be okay.
That history professor I mentioned earlier, Paddy Corish, he had a knife in sentimental 19th century Irish nationalist ballads. I often think of this one. You know, the West's Awake, that old one. You know that line in it, that chainless wave and lovely land, freedom and nationhood demand, be sure the great God never planned for slumbering slaves a home so grand.
Wow.
Are we in danger of slumber?
Oh yeah, we are. We're in deep, deep danger.
I keep thinking of those few lines. They keep coming into my head the last few years.
Well, you see, this slavery is the point. You see, because once you allow your passions or your instincts to rule you, then you have become a slave, because they will enslave you. Like, that's what alcoholism is. It is slavery to the bottle. That's it, really.
Yeah.
In a way, if you want to say what happened to me, I became a slave to alcohol. And you can become a slave to any number of things.
Yes.
And that's actually it. And the problem is, you see, when a society becomes enslaved in all these ways, in a multiplicity maybe of ways, it will actually give up freedom, real freedom, thinking that freedom is to continue on this path to destruction. And I think that's kind of where we are.
I think we're getting a carefully bottled form of freedom with different proofs allowed by the government. But we may have to go back to broom puching.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think so.
Up in the mountains.
Well, you see, one of the big problems with all of this, Brendan, is that there are no conversations anymore in a society. I mean, I keep saying this, like, and the concepts like society and democracy, they're almost like the wrong kind of words to be using. Human existence, human interaction, human community needs conversations.
Yes.
So that it understands fully the breadth, the full breadth of possibility.
Yeah.
And we've lost all that, because it's amazing, you know, if I live in South Dublin and Dún Laoghaire area now, and I go off and walk on the pier, and it's a very interesting thing, you know, to walk up and down. And just, you know, I'm deaf in one ear now the last few years, but I can still hear fairly well. And for some reason, I think the other ears got better, you know.
Sure.
So I hear these snatches of conversation, like, and it's extraordinary what you kind of gather from people like that. It is true, you know, that people, they all think the same things. They all think about the same things. Very narrow, the same names. Like they talk about sort of Elon Musk as if he was like their next door neighbour.
Yes. You
know, that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
I was talking to a woman in a charity shop yesterday, and she sells books, a lot of books, you know, and she's very picky at the one she accepts, you know, but she's another woman in the shop who isn't picky, you know, and she says she's constantly having to cull books. She says, but she says it's amazing. She says the numbers of books of certain authors she gets in. Lee Child, she mentioned, like, I mean, nothing against him, but she says so many people read the same books and think the same thoughts. And that's a new thing in civilization, in the world. It's a new thing, because before, even in our own culture, like, everybody had their own headspace and was able to share it, you know. I mean, you know, the point of going back into like things like talking about the way the culture used to be is not nostalgia. It's actually, well, let's look at what they did and try to modernize it, try to apply it in some way. And I think that actually, people talk about the Ramblin' House. Now, when I was a child, we spent the summers in my grandmother's house out in Kilcoyne, beside her, because my grandfather used to work for the French family, Pearse French's family, as a farm manager. And they had, in a sense, the house at the gates of the estate, you know. It was kind of we never called it a Ramblin' House, but I've heard the phrase since, and that's what it was, you know. Because every week, all the neighbours would come from miles around.
Good Lord. Yeah.
Dead of night, like, in the middle of winter, like, even in darkness, with flash lamps, maybe, the ones that were the rich ones, you know.
Yeah.
And they would walk across the fields or across the boreens, and they would sit there drinking tea. No drink, like, just tea, for like 3-4 hours, and just talk and talk and talk.
Good God.
About everything. That's an entirely different culture, because they were bringing with them their whole...
Yes.
Not just what things happen, but their imaginative response to them.
Yes. Now
people are sitting, if you go out and around any area in the country, you'll see the same glare out of every window.
Yes.
they're watching the same people.
Yeah.
And there's nothing much going on. You know, all of this stuff that we're trying to get at is buried now and cannot be excavated unless we make a decision that it's missing, that we need to have this conversation. We need to reimagine our total reality.
Yes.
Because otherwise we will be deeper and deeper into the bunker.
Yeah.
Which is the world that is we made, and we understand everything about it.
Yeah.
And we think, therefore, that we are all knowing.
Didn't Orwell in 1984 envision was it a machine invented by the government called a versificator or something, that it just churned out corny, meaningless songs and tunes and everyone would be singing them,
That's
thinking
right, you
that
did,
they
yeah.
were very, very much with things, you know.
Well, you know, we're actually on the absolute cusp of that now, because apparently artificial intelligence will actually be able to, within 5 to 10 years, will be able to produce an entire newspaper without human intervention.
Yeah.
That's
an interesting,
isn't it? I mean, because they've you see, this is again to kind of digress slightly, but I mean, this is a very critical moment in history in this sense, because it's a moment that is kind of, it only happens, this is kind of on the cusp of the artificial intelligence revolution. It's very analogous to the kind of machine revolution that happened 100 years ago. The production line and all that, you know, the factory. And Frederick Taylor was the guy who invented all these methodologies and procedures. And they were first put out on the Ford Motor Company. And the Ford went from, in 1908, every car was built by hand. Within 5 years, they were all on a production line. And they were all the same, and they were all, well, they could be made different, but they were all essentially the same. And there was no handcraft involved. It was all in the machines. It was all, it had been plundered from the craftsmen.
Yes.
And vested in the machines.
Yes.
And the same is about to happen to the human race now, in the final, I think, stage of that, where their minds will be plundered for whatever creativity is left. That will be vested in the machines, and the human race will be more or less left to vegetate in hive cities or smart cities. And the one thing we know about smart cities is they will be smarter than their inhabitants. So,
yes.
So this is another very this is a moment. Therefore, it could be a last chance, and I mean that really advisedly. I mean, I think that the human race, the crisis that we're facing, you know, you could call it a spiritual crisis. That is what it is, but it's also, and perhaps more accurately described, as a human crisis. Yeah. Because people misunderstand the idea of a spiritual crisis. They think, well, that means that people are going away from religion.
Oh, no, sure. No,
that's not the problem.
Yeah, no.
The problem is that religion is going away from humans.
Yes.
They don't, because they're losing the very essence, the very most essential understandings of their own structure and being. They're lost entirely in culture almost now.
Do you care for the Coen brothers, for their work?
I do, yeah.
That recent one, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, the old trapper telling stories. You know, he said, people are like ferrets, all the same.
Yes.
He keeps repeating this line.
Yes.
But it's actually, you feel, because their films are very intelligent.
Yes.
You feel a point is being made. You know,
yes.
That's actually...
Well, I think that we as people now, you see, this is a terrible trap, that people now verify everything, not by evidence, but by how many other people think it. You know, that's kind of that's their test. I mean, we still maybe think at some level that people take their information by reading the newspaper or listening to the news bulletin, saying, oh, okay, I heard it, noting all the information, parsing it, you know, classifying it, and then making up their own mind. But they don't really. They hear something, and then they hear it again, and then they hear it again, and then it becomes the truth.
Yeah.
So you can manipulate that very easily by just repeating things.
Because we so want to belong.
Yeah, that's it. That's right. I think that's something that I discovered rather late in life, you know, that probably the desire to belong is probably a greater craving than hunger or thirst. There's nothing worse in some ways, unless you can train yourself out of it. For most people, there's nothing worse than being cast out of the tribe.
Yeah.
And they just can't bear the thought of it.
It is. It's not a small matter.
No, it's not at all. And it's something we don't think about. It's not something we've paid any notice to at all. how significant it is for all of us.
And we're great at fighting talk about that. I don't give a damn what anyone thinks of me.
Yeah.
This, that. You need to say that with some respect. That's the price for that is high. Like if nobody agrees with you.
Oh boy,
yeah,
that's right. I mean, it's a very easy thing to say, and in fact, I'd be very suspicious of a person who said it all.
I completely agree.
Because it means that they really do care.
Yes.
If you really don't care what people think of you, then you need to care enough not to say it, that it becomes obvious.
The Australian writer Patrick Whitey is this tragic depiction of a couple, they're Jews, who in Vienna turned Catholic, again to belong. They'd emigrate to Australia and discover that everyone's Protestant. Having gone to all the trouble, they've sold out everything.
Yes.
I'm not saying that you shouldn't become Catholic if you believe in Catholicism, but they had done it just to belong, and then discovered that in fact they've miscalculated.
That's right. It's very interesting. There was a family in our street when I was a child, and an elderly lady. I used to do her messages for her. She was very elderly, you know, and she had two sons. One of them was called Paddy, and one of them was called Victor. And Paddy had children, and he used to come home with his kids. You know, they lived right across the street from us for a long time before we moved. And we used to be having pillow fights, and they'd come in the summer. You know, they're English, you know, and we're fascinated by them. But Victor went to Belfast and became a Protestant, and it was very convenient. Victor is a great Protestant name, you see, where Paddy wouldn't really work.
No.
You know? But it was an amazing sort of, it's almost like a novel happening in your presence, you know, because Victor very rarely came home, but Paddy came home all the time. It's really amazing, you know, that to be isolated is a very, you know, it can kill you, you know.
Yes, yes.
You know, I mean, the human being needs to be in touch and literally in touch with people, and to be cast out. I mean, I think, you know, many people find it unbearable. Apparently,
the communist authorities in Russia, we would think that when they threw somebody out, wasn't that great for them? They got out, but they knew what they were doing.
Yes.
Because many Russians wilt outside of their homeland, outside of Solzhenitsyn suffered terribly, apparently, in his exile.
He did, he did. And he became very crotchety.
He did.
Yeah. It's come into my mind, just a story from my childhood. And it's one of those stories which I don't tell often of these kind of things, but it's a kind of a slightly dark side of the church, in a certain sense. And it was a brother we had who was quite a brilliant teacher, and he was the one who started me writing, you know, because I remember, I'll never forget the day. I'll just tell the story first to his credit, because normally he would just collect the essays, you know, and read and then mark them up and then give them back to us in a week or so. And he says, no, he says, today I want to do something different. He says, today I want you all to pick out your best sentence, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to perfect the sentence, and then you can read out the result. And I just started doodling with this sentence. And I read out the sentence. And I can't remember, all I remember, it had the phrase in it, to the naked eye. That's all I can remember. It was about a bird, and it was the naked eye. And he praised me to the sky. He praised this, not me, he praised the sentence to the skies. Like, I thought, my God. And from then on, he kept saying, well, wait till we see what Waters has to say on this.
Okay.
And that's what started me interested in the idea that I could write.
Yes.
The downside of him was he had a bizarre system of punishments, and he had a team. Every row would be a team, you see.
Yeah.
And the captain would be in the front seat, and then there would be 5 or 6 going back. And you would vie with every other team, but you know, when you got your mental arithmetic wrong, you would get minuses, or if you got a good essay and got a +2 or whatever, all that. You would start the week at 100 points, and at the end of the week, you would get off homework if you weren't, if you won the winning team, and then you get so many slaps apiece. Then for every point you were below 100. That's another story. But the interesting thing about this was, he actually said, before he introduced this system, he said, if you don't want to go through this system, he says, you have to bring a note in from your parents. You know, you won't be included, but I won't teach you either. Mm-hmm. And the amazing thing was that actually the lads who brought in the notes, I didn't, because I would be afraid to just ask me, you know.
Fair enough.
But they were all from what you might call the lowest socioeconomic levels. We were fairly low, near the low, but this was like the kind of the low. And they all just sat over there at the side, out of the whole thing. And you know, even we regarded them as kind of an inferior species in our class, you know. It was very bad education in lots of ways, but also very good in another, in the sense that it showed us that there's something in the world that we take for granted, you know, that this sense of fellow feeling is not to be taken for granted. Like, people often don't really understand, you know, when you're getting into arguments with people about Christianity or with atheists, they always go for the same thing, which is that, well, I don't need any church to tell me. I'm a moral person. You know, I remember actually once doing a debate with Christopher Hitchens in Dublin years ago when his book came out, God Is Not Great. We had an interesting kind of ding-dong, and at a certain point he said to me, he says, I don't know what religion you belong to. He says, it's not like anyone I've ever come across. And I says, oh, that's because you've spent the last 3 years in your bunker fantasizing about all these psychopaths and fanatics. I says, and now you're out, you can't find any. Yeah. But he said, well, and he came out of it, and he says that he didn't need any religion to be a moral person. And I says, well, the problem with that, Christopher, is that you lived all your life, as I have, in a Christian civilization.
There you are, yeah.
And I says, so in order to test that thesis, what we need to do now, I says, is we need to adjourn this meeting for 2,000 years. Mm. And we'll come back then and we'll see how we'll try your model. And we'll see how it went in 2,000 years. Yeah. And that's the thing, you see. But morality is only such a tiny part, what we call morality, and it can become, as we've been saying, it can become simplistic and superficial and rule-based. Yeah. But as I say, it's written in the heart of man, yes, these rules. But there are so many other dimensions that we forget about. Yeah. It's not just morality. You don't just need Christianity to maintain order. Yeah. You need it to generate hope in a society, which is no small thing. Yeah. There is a Christian empathy which we shouldn't take for granted. And I think that's a very simple. I was telling you a story before we started, and I'll tell it again because to me it was a very telling moment. I was in Prague in 1990 covering the first free elections for the Irish Times, and I mean I'd been aware of Václav Havel for a good few years, and I'd been reading his essays, and was fascinated by the way he used to talk about the comparisons between the West and the East, because he didn't take the view that, you know, capitalism, the West was a kind of a salvation for the communist refugee, you know. Mm-hmm. He said that Soviet communism was a convex mirror image of the West. In other words, it just exaggerated somewhat the same tendencies in the West, mm-hmm. which I think is, you know, evident.
That's interesting.
Very evident, right, at the moment. But he used to talk about the effects of communism, the granular effects of communism on the psyche of the Eastern Bloc people, but they were kind of abstractions to my mind. I couldn't really grasp what he meant. He just thought they were kind of atomization and, you know, this sense of alienation that people and. But I one day I got a sort of an insight. I was going into I had to send a fax back to Dublin, or a message back to Dublin, or a telegram or something. I can't remember what the format was in those days there. But so I had to go to the post office in Prague, and there was a giant what do you call those doorways? Revolving door. And you see them all over the place. You don't think about them much when you're. No. So I was coming into it, and I suppose whatever process. It's only afterwards, again, you kind of construct this in your mind as something like that was going on. Okay, so you're approaching the door from the outside. There's a man coming at it from the other side, inside. So you do what you would have done in Dublin, which is you see him, you make eye contact, you believe, and so you move towards the door so that there's a harmony. He comes in his side, you come in your side, and you go through it.
You both get through.
Yeah. So I did that. And he nearly cut me in two. Like, he just, I was thrown out of the door, or arm caught in or something like that. And I thought, that's what Havel's talking about. Yeah. He didn't see me. He doesn't see. They don't see each other. That's the absence of that empathy from a culture cannot be quantified or estimated or anticipated. And that's kind of one of the consequences of what we're doing now to our civilization, and particularly in Ireland, I think it's a culture that was very rich in that way, which was all about, and whatever you might critique it on the basis that has some degrees of insincerity sometimes, but overall, it embraced people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it enabled people to embrace each other figuratively, to care if you have a problem. Like the way that people would walk up to you, you would see you looking around in the street and say, "Are you all right there? Can I help you?"
Yeah.
Or just the way that people would speak to each other and change the whole dynamic of their day.
People negotiated each other.
They did, yeah. That's right, negotiation. That's exactly the thing about the doorway that revolved. That's the word in that door. That there was no negotiation between that man and me. He wasn't interested. He just wanted to go out at the door, and I better stand out of his way, or he was going to bull through, and that was that.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of perfect metaphor for
the devil take the hindmost.
Yeah. And these little subtleties, sometimes you can see a lot in them. Matthew Crawford actually talks about that. He's a philosopher he lives in California now, San Jose, I think, and he's a motorcycle mechanic and philosopher. He's written a number of books about the working with your hands, the connection between the senses, but particularly the hands, and thinking. And I think that's such a true thing, that those generations which came before me, that I remember, my father and my mother and my grandmother, they had no education in that sense, but they were very brilliant people in lots of ways, you know, very intelligent, very smart, very, very, you know, wise people. And we're losing all that capacity because thought has become so abstract and received. And isn't that kind of vested in the experience and just engaging with reality. So you think about it, like, you know, if you watch a child, I have a little step-grandson now, Mark, and he's still through. He'll be 3 in a couple of months. And like he's playing on the mat there, you know, and every single thing he takes up, he looks at it and he feels it, and he might put it in his mouth.
Yes.
And you know, he's looking, then if he's loading up some bricks in from Munter, he's watching, and you can see him like he's trying to make space for them all, and he's trying to but he's using the hands. And if you think about it, that's the way. That's not just an activity that keeps him busy there for the first few years of his life. He's building his whole understanding of the world like that, which is how we do that. We all do that. We have done that from the beginning, until at a certain point it becomes abstract, because we go into an education system that cuts that off and gives us other people's ideas of things, which is fine, so long as we continue to explore the world in that way as well, and reconcile everything we learn to what we're experiencing in our own reality. Trying to reconcile means, I suppose, both to find agreement, concurrence, but also disagreement and dissonance. And that's such a necessary process all the time. The problem is if you just take the whole thing, learn it off by rote.
Yeah.
I had a friend he taught he used to teach people how to speed read, and he was a very shrewd character, because he used to teach politicians and all kinds of people, you know. And he used to always say to me, you know, I'd say, "Oh, your man's a very smart guy." He says, "Do you think?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "I know him, yeah." He says, "He's not as smart as you think." He says, "But he has a very good memory." Okay. You see, there's a big difference.
Yeah.
The retention and intelligence are two different things. We've lost that understanding. So a lot of this is, you know, goes to the whole problem that we have in our culture of dissecting what's important for ourselves and for the life of our people and our families and our, you know, the future, the posterity, because we're leaving them a terrible crock in lots of ways.
We've touched on this, you know, we've gone in and out of it, but I don't know that we've bitten the bullet. This business of being Irish, I can't imagine you except as an Irishman, although I know you negotiate with other things outside of Ireland and different, and yet you seem to me an Irishman, as I feel I am an Irishman. But what does that even mean? Is it possible that it meant something once and that meaning is leaching away? I don't know. I somehow feel that there's something frail about that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily about your Irishness, but about mine, about the whole thing. So I suppose I just want to start by asking, because it seems deeply rooted in you. Am I right in that you feel very much?
I do. I agree. I do, and at the same time, I agree with you about the frailty of it in all of us, because the whole globalist project seems to me directed at undermining that.
Yes.
You know, it's like undermining the glue that attaches us to our place and our nation and our behalf.
Which is logical from that point of view, you know, is that they want to reduce the friction, they want easier administration, they want bigger maybe units of government. But is that what we want?
Well, there's that, Brendan, but there's also that they also want to make us amenable consumers.
There we are, yeah.
You know, that's the primary product I think of it, that when you deracinate people, you remove those attachments which would compete with the consumer experience. Because the consumer experience is very much tied to that false idea of freedom that we talked about. You know, that because, and I've written about this, and I mean, because this is interesting, that's very important to say this, you know. I don't say these things from some high moral ground where I'm sort of judging. I actually say it completely from my own experience, because I try and watch myself and the way that I am waylaid by certain ideas.
Sure.
I go through phases, like, I mean, and I've written about this. You go through phases maybe of buying new, you know, T-shirts or sneakers or something like that, you know. And I'm very fascinated by the idea of that for a little while, for a moment or 2 or 10, you get the idea somewhere deep within yourself that this is the answer to everything.
Yes.
This item.
Yes.
You know, and that it will change your life.
Yeah.
And that when you put it on, that moment will be perfect, you know. And that's the consumer thing. That's what they're selling. They're not selling items.
Yes.
They're selling dreams.
Yeah.
But the dreams very rarely come true. But let's put it at its highest.
Yeah.
And so that therefore, you know, that's what they're offering us instead of our loyalties. And it's not just nationhood. It's also, there are 3 fundamental loyalties that I think they have attacked in recent times. Nationhood is one. Before that is, or after that, is family. And above all, there is the relationship with God. Those 3 represent enormous threats to the would-be order of power, what I call the combine, because there's all these different elements now in the world, you know, big tech and big data and big government and big whatever. The combine, that was a phrase actually from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Chief Bromden, that's what he used to call this vague entity that was always manipulating everything, the combine. It's a beautiful concept. Yeah. So these overarching loyalties that of nature a man would die for. A man would die for his family, for his children. He would die for his nation, has done. Many men have died, many women too. And he would die for his belief in God, and has, many men and women have died. That's a terrible threat to those who would have all power in the world.
Yeah.
And that's where it all comes from. So therefore, that they're working away on that. And I've been conscious of them working away on it for the last, I would say for the last 50 years, very strongly in Ireland. I would say almost since, I remember very clearly 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Rising. And I think that at that time, everything was more or less intact. I mean, it wasn't a perfect country. There was zealotry and fanaticism and all kinds of things. But I'm talking about the deep, passionate attachment to Ireland was universal in Ireland. It was, again, it was like the belief in God. It was obvious. It was non-controversial. And then that kind of started changing for the reason, first in this instance, that the troubles started in the north, and that created certain kind of ricochets, as it were, down here and so on. But to answer your question, I mean, what is it? What does it mean? Well, you see, you can't break it down. It's not blood, it's not soil, purely. I mean, those are purely abstractions to kind of measure, something that isn't really, won't give you the right answer. It's something that is, it's a passion that is, like last night when we arrived here, I used to work here many years ago, more years than I can even account for, you know, God almighty, if I told you the many years, I can't believe I would be saying these numbers, you know. It's actually 43 years since I left Westport, having worked here for a couple of years. But we were looking across from the hill outside town at the Reek, you know, and I can't describe like what it does to me to look at that site, like.
Yes.
I mean, and that's Ireland, and that was in my head. This is Ireland. Now I can again going back to the thing about the words. We use the least inadequate words. Mm-hmm. You know, I love Ireland deeply, in a way that it's not possible to love a hunk of territory or land, an island. I don't know what that is. How do you love an island?
Yeah. But
I do, and it's not just the landscape. It's not just. If I was to identify one quality that sort of speaks for everything, it is about the Irish sense of humour. Mm. It's the connection that happens. It's an electricity that happens between two Irish people, randomly, haphazardly, accidentally almost. And then it just fills, it's like there's no poaching, no drink that can make you feel as good. Yeah. It could only last for 30 seconds, but it's like an electric current that charges you again. Because you know you come from, you've connected to the very, the antecedents of the antecedents. I mean, it's been there always like that. Yeah. Because of the history that came down upon it. Yeah. And the reactions to it. You know, and you can see it in the best of our art, you know, the best of our writing, in Beckett and Martin McDonagh, I think, is very got it. As an outsider, he got it, like, you know. I mean, there's a brilliant line at the very open of the Beauty Queen of Lenan, where the old lady is sitting in the chair in the house, and her daughter is, or much put upon daughter, is sweeping the step or something like that, and the old lady says to her, she says, "Wet, Maureen?" And she says, "Of course, wet," you know. And there's a deep pessimism that is absolutely hilarious, you know, to the Irish person. Yes. You just burst out laughing when you hear that.
What were you expecting?
That's the whole history of the country, like in an exchange, you know. But there's an attitude as well. It's like, well, what, we can't go on, we must go on, we go on.
That's right.
And that's going, you know. It's been ironed out of us. You don't see it so much, you don't encounter it so much now among young people, particularly in the cities. In the country you will. You know, you could be in a hotel in the west of Ireland, like, and there'll be a young fella or a young girl, like, and she'll be maybe just working in the dining room for the holidays. And she'll actually come over and have a conversation with you that has no angles to it other than this is who she is. Yeah. You don't find that very often now in the world.
Just two human beings.
Yeah, and understanding each other. Yeah. Reading between lines and reading all kinds of things.
Negotiating each other.
Okay, negotiating at a deep level. Of that can actually, you know, almost like inspire you to confess your innermost secrets in that moment. It's so pure.
Do you remember the ending of that play, The Week in the Life of a Shopkeeper's Assistant, Tom Murphy?
I know the play,
It's where the young fella loses the head with the family and with all its secrets in the small town. He stands out in the street and starts telling the street what the parents think of them, which is of course causing chaos.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
The way Irish people are so careful with each other.
Yes.
A lot of Irish people would have had no trouble making it in diplomacy. You know? And apparently Irish diplomats are very skilled. From a small country, they're very busy everywhere.
There's there's that side of us that we can read. It's amazing, actually. We can read each other very well, very fast, mostly. I mean, it's actually one of the funniest occasions for comedy is the whole idea of somebody in the group who doesn't get it and who isn't tuned in and who's saying things. And I've had that experience so many times where we read each other so fast, but one person won't read and they'll walk right into it. And it's an amazing thing to watch, you know, that it used to never happen. That somebody could fail to actually understand the dynamics. Tom Murphy used to talk about this, you know, language and subtext. I wrote about this recently. He was telling me one day about the importance of subtext, because he says in a play, he says it's all subtext. Everything is, the words are, again, it's a little bit how we're talking about, you know, about. But he gave me this example of, which is quite funny, very small, very minor, little. But he says, imagine, he says, and of course Tom was very droll. Imagine, you know, and you go into a bar, you know, and there's an old fella sitting up on the stool by the bar, and there's another stool nearby, and you sit down and you say, "How are you doing?" And he says, and you engage at some level, you know, just pleasantries. But then you kind of maybe ask a kind of a curious question, or it's like, you know, that kind of idea down the West piece. Is it information you're looking for?
Yes.
You know, that kind of question. And he says, and Murphy says, and he says to you, he says, yeah, but what's your name like, you know?
Yeah.
He says, every single syllable of that had deep meaning.
Yes.
You know, and you have to be able to read it.
Yeah.
This is the thing, you see, because it's like he's saying to you, all right, yeah, but you didn't introduce yourself to me.
Yeah.
How dare you ask me questions of this nature without telling me your name, you blackguard. You know, but the you know is softer. It's like, okay, you're on your last chance now.
Yeah. It's a way of asking for your papers.
It is, it is. And this is something that, you know, what happens you see, in a culture that you push that out of, or extinguish it, like, is that it becomes all completely formulaic.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, people then start to converse in lines from soap operas.
Okay.
And think like the lines.
Yes.
And you must remember, with all due respect, like that soap operas are written by failed playwrights. And they also have an instrumental intention, generally speaking now, for propaganda and whatnot. You know, they're writing storylines that are directed at particular objectives from a sociological and cultural viewpoint. So this is something that, again, passes notice.
Yeah.
The loss of that deep subtlety in a culture that we were all able to read one time. But now everybody just blunders across the lines because they're not, they think everything will be conveyed instrumentally in a very kind of perfunctory manner, you know. You know, that it's all about telling you what's happened yesterday and what's the next plot twist is coming up, is, you know, that's not how life is.
Yeah.
And that's a big factor, I think, in what's happened to our young people. Because remember, the generations that are growing up in the last 30 years, they're the first generations that have essentially been reared by strangers in crisis care, childcare, because of the change in the workplace. And that has that effect on them, that you know, their main access to understanding the world has been through cartoons, soap operas, and such like.
Yeah.
So they're never in the situation that we were in as children, where I was going on with my father, like, and my father had all these friends, like, who were all tradesmen of different kinds, you know, mechanics or dressmakers or saddlers or whatever it was, and he would go into their workshop, like, and they would stop working for, it seemed like, any length of time you could possibly want. You know, like shoemakers, like, they would literally talk for 3 hours, and he wouldn't put a nail in the shoe, you know. And I would just sit there on whatever it was, like on a butter box or a bag of meal, and listen. And that's another thing, you know, that it goes in, you see. And obviously, I couldn't actually recite a single sentence that I heard from any of those men, but it's all in there.
Yes.
All of this has been snatched, been like hoovered out of culture without us even talking about it.
Yeah. You mentioned eccentricity earlier. Is it possible that maybe a strong national feeling has become an intolerable eccentricity?
It
an
has.
Indulgence, almost, viewed as an indulgence.
Well, you see, this is an interesting thing. You see, how does this happen? And is this, you see, these things have the appearance of being organic, of being naturalistic phenomena, but they're not at all. They're all engineered, in my opinion, and you can be created. You know, I mean, you can see them coming now, where there's a certain war declared clearly in the media on certain kinds of thinking, you know, and there's a little bit of talking about, well, maybe it's time to do away with the national anthem, or maybe it's time to do away with the tricolour, or whatever, where we have a new kind of flag, or whatever. See, these things are floated, kites, and all that is and when I look back, I mean, I became very acutely aware of that when I came to Dublin. Having come from the West, those things were kind of, again, non-controversial.
Yeah.
And your loyalty to Ireland and your affection for Ireland was axiomatic. And then to find that these things were being questioned and regarded as bad things, you know, and dangerous things, and that somehow it was, the fact that I loved Ireland had something to do with some Protestant getting shot in Armagh.
Yes.
And I couldn't really see the connection, you know. And it was like that if we get rid of the feeling, then we'll eliminate the murders.
Yes.
Which it seems to me to be nonsense, did then and does now. Because, I mean, that's the one way to madden people, is to actually remove their passions.
Yeah.
So there's all that going on. And yes, I do find now that it is regarded as an eccentric thing. And I often say to friends of mine who are a bit like-minded that, we are now like really strange specimens in Ireland who continue to talk about this thing, this love for Ireland. There's a kind of a thing that has come up in recent years where you see it on certain TV programs where the interviewers, it's a kind of a so what mentality, or who cares, if Ireland is over, who cares, that kind of thing. And it doesn't matter. And all I can say to that is that, well, I'll be gone, but if you think it doesn't matter, then you're going to have to live with the consequences.
Yes.
Because I think it matters a hell of a lot.
Well, they're busy trying to sell Irishness, but you'd be hard put to say what it is that they're selling.
Yes.
Whether they understand what they're selling, whether they understand how little is left in what they're selling.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there was always that kind of disjunction. Luke Gibbons has done a lot of work about this, that on the one hand they're selling this kind of kitschy kind of cottages and ass carts view of Ireland, and then they're trying to sell Ireland as a perfect kind of place to bring your chemical industry.
There we go.
And they can't they're irreconcilable in every conceivable way, and indeed it's the chaos. That's an exact parable of the chaos we're talking about. Because there's a strange thing about Ireland. It's very hard it's intangible. Because if you actually try to name it, it disappears. It's a bit like God in that. Do
you remember Clark's? It used to be on for the Leaving Cert, or Clark's poem, "The Lost Heifer." I often think of it. It's a beautiful description of the lowing of the heifer, the rain, the soft rain, the wind and the grass. That kind of thing. It's very evocative of the Irish landscape and weather.
Yes.
And you have the heifer that you can't see, but you can faintly hear the lowing.
Yes.
So what is Ireland?
Yes. Well, Kavanagh used to talk about this, and Kavanagh went on all that journey through his life, and he wrote those books, The Green Fool and then Terry Flynn, and he more or less disowned both of them after, because he said they were too Irishy, And he used to say that, when a horse wins the Grand National, what matters is its horsiness, it's not its Irishness, and I get that as well. But you see, there's this trap, and I think it's actually a function of our arrested development as a culture because of occupation, that we're constantly thinking you can define something at some point in its trajectory in a perfect way. Whereas if your culture is uninterrupted, it just is. But because ours was consistently and persistently interrupted, we are constantly having to try to find the moment at which it was itself. And to reinvent it. That happened after independence, that we tried to reinvent ourselves by going backwards and rediscovering some Ireland, some authentic Ireland. Remember, there was all this stuff about, banning jazz and all this sort of stuff in the 40s. Because that was non-Irish, and the de-Anglicisation of Ireland had that. But I mean, there was this paradox that even we were half English already.
There we are, the West British thing. But to what extent is that actually not? Isn't it really there?
It's there, but there's another side as well. You see, if you think about it, Brendan, like when I was growing up in the West, and we weren't really conscious of any of this. It just was, but. Like we were in school and we were hearing the brothers and in 66, and it was all Pearse and Connolly and MacDonald and all that, and the Bowl Fenian men and all that. And at the same time at home we were reading like Enid Blyton and the Dandy and the Hotspur, and so we were kind of, there was a kind of a certain split in us, but we were able to reconcile that. Like, we didn't dislike one because of the other, or vice versa. You know what I mean? We didn't reject the English influence by virtue of a loyalty to Ireland, nor did we reject Ireland because we liked this stuff from England. And we were able to like Ivor Browne used to talk about that the Irish personality has a great capacity for both this and that. Whereas the English is either or. Anglo-Saxon is you have to be one thing or another. Paul Durcan has a poem about that. He says, you have to be one side. You have to pick one side or the other. You're nothing but a fucking romantic.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what we are. We're fucking romantics. Yeah. And I think that that holding things in is part of the humour as well.
Okay.
Because we can laugh at ourselves while expressing the deepest pathos.
Can I bring up something that I believe is just about contained in the attic by modern Ireland? I thought the management of the commemoration in 1916 was masterly. It was a masterly exercise in palliative care. You know, I really thought it was very well done. I didn't think they could do it that well, because as we both know, what stalked through the post office, I don't know if that's Yeats' line, is not easily tamed.
No.
Collins has been kind of given to us as the kind of glamour boy.
Yes.
Which is a very simplistic understanding of quite a dark, ruthless man.
Very.
Yeah. Collins was a hard man.
Very hard.
Very hard man. DeValera has been sold to us as the baddie, as the bad guy.
That's right.
When in fact we both know DeValera was actually a very complex man.
Yes.
You know?
Very brilliant man in many ways.
Yes. And a rugby player and Carson hurler.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, those crazy things in Irish history. But they don't seem to want to talk about another man much, which I find fascinating, is that he hasn't been rehabilitated as Pearse.
No.
I think they're afraid of Pearse.
They are afraid of him because he carries the whole sense of the history. I mean, there's so many misunderstandings, in my opinion, and in my view of the whole thing, of our history in that regard. I mean, the guys that came before, the great figures, O'Connell and Parnell, all these guys, and Redmond, they were a different breed, different mentality completely to Pearse. And maybe Collins, I think, was owed more to Pearse in that respect. But Pearse's sense of Ireland was that Ireland had been enslaved. That's the central understanding you need to with Pearse. Like, that's what he's not talking about negotiating, our independence or anything. He's talking about freeing slaves,
slumbering slaves.
Yes, breaking their chains, and he saw this as a profoundly existential mission. And he understood it, I think, totally. I mean, you have to go on another 60 years and read Frantz Fanon, writing out of Algeria in the Civil War there in the late 50s. You have to go to him to actually find a more embellished description of the slave mentality and the process of liberation.
The wretched of the earth.
Yes. Yeah, and I suspect that Fanon would have been aware of Pearse, because Pearse was hinting, or he was stating these things in very kind of broad strokes in his essays there before, in the 2 years before the Rising. And that's the thing that people don't get, because I keep hearing people saying, well, you know, if he'd waited another 2 years, we'd have got our independence, you know, they'd have given us home rule. He didn't want home rule. He didn't want to be given. He said it, you know, that it is a glory to be achieved, not a concession to be granted.
Yeah.
And that was the key thing of the whole point of the Rising from his point of view. So he was a different kind of person. And he was a very gentle man, but he believed in that you know, that slavery is a form of violence, obviously, a very extreme form of violence, and can only be met with violence.
Yeah.
And that's the way, again, you have to see. I mean, you can't apply our logic of the present moment, or it would be terrible to go up and go shooting around the GPO. Yes, it would be stupid, but that's not what was happening. Mm-hmm. There was a liberation struggle. There was a liberation of the very psyche and soul of the Irish human person. Mm-hmm. And that was his mission. And that was a far bigger mission than any of those figures who came. They're not comparable, in my opinion, nothing like it, nor indeed anyone who came after him. I think the greatest tragedy in the entire history of Ireland was the execution of Harry Pearse. And
many would say it was the death of Collins, the untimely death of Collins, that he was the lost leader.
Well, Collins was I think of him almost as Pearse's executor.
Yeah.
Because he implemented...
That's interesting.
the mission in a very practical way.
People tend to forget, I think, that Collins was very determined, once the Free State had been consolidated, to continue the war surreptitiously in the north.
Yes. Yes. Oh, he would have. Yeah. Yeah. He was a soldier.
Yeah.
Like Pearse wasn't a soldier at all.
No.
Clark was the real soldier among the signatories and among their insurrectionaries, but Pearse was a very brave man.
Yeah.
And his brother Willie was a very brave man. I mean, they were fantastic people. And again, we're talking now, to go back briefly to the question of Irishness and all that. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine the kind of mentality? Have we ever met a man who is prepared to die for Ireland?
There you go.
Is it any more than meeting Jesus Christ and trying to figure out what he would say to you? Like, can you imagine a man like that, what he would say to you?
And yet I can't help feeling that as a culture, to paraphrase, if I may, the words of Jesus Christ, for he that tries, what is it? He that loses his life shall save it, but he that tries to save it, even so shall he lose it.
Yeah.
We've turned our face away from self-sacrifice, and yet we still find that what we have is falling through our fingers.
Yes.
We've sold that for something else, but that doesn't last.
No, it doesn't last at all.
Yeah.
And you see, we didn't understand any of that stuff, and in fairness, it was very simplistically conveyed, I think.
Sure.
And no more than Christianity was simplistically conveyed. So we didn't really understand, except there were like just kind of shadowy figures moving on a screen, as it were, in the past, and they had weird ideas,
mm-hmm.
and we couldn't contextualize them in the present. And nor indeed they couldn't be and can't be contextualized in the present, because the whole sentiment, the whole passion, the whole context is missing. Even then, I mean, it wasn't entirely uncontroversial to what they did by any means. But afterwards it became so, that it became axiomatic that this needed to be done.
Yeah.
And there was no other way.
Yeah.
If Ireland's dignity was to be preserved. But you see, what happened then was, I think DeValera, my father was a Finn Gaelor, Cumann Gaelor and all that, and he obviously therefore thought DeValera was the devil.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But he used to always say that DeValera did one great thing, and that was the Constitution of 1937.
Yeah.
He said that he thought that was a fabulous document, and then again, that was the level. My father used to carry, like at the time, I found it after he died, the Dracht Bonracht. It's carried around in his pocket, and it was all earmarked and marked, and
Good God.
These discussions would take place, in these workshops.
Yeah.
That was I think Crawford talks about that. Matthew Crawford, the philosopher, the American guy who talked about it, he thought that is the republic. That is the real republic, where that interaction between men who are in control of their powers.
Yes.
In other words, their hands.
Yeah.
They can make and fix things.
Yes.
And they then apply that thinking to the world.
Yeah.
And that's the republic. And that's, again, an idea that is so beautiful, and such a beautiful encapsulation of what a democracy and what a republic might be. But we can't simplify things in that way anymore. So I do think that DeValera was a brilliant man, but he didn't have Pearse's vision.
Yeah.
He didn't see this profound necessity of the slave to free himself, symbolically and actually, to shake off the manacles, to break them off himself, and strike back, not necessarily in a lethal way, but to assert his humanity. I mean, all those great men were executed, and it's somewhat unfair to say that DeValera was the captain of the second 15, but there's a sense in which he was kind of trying to do everything himself, and he didn't have all the talents that you would have needed to do that. And he was up against very, very tricky forces as well that were working against any true liberation project. Ireland never really became free, I don't think, we never succeeded in doing what Pearse wanted. We always remained culturally tied to an idea. We couldn't figure ourselves out in conceptual terms. We couldn't describe ourselves. We couldn't define ourselves. And we were always trying, We always wanted to know what everybody else thought of us, you see, because we had no self-confidence. That idea, you see, that Kavanagh talked about this idea of the Irishness thing and the Irish thing and how tricky it was. And it is true, and you see, if you can see the threads of this confusion arising in modern Irish literature. For a while there, you saw this kind of eruption of kind of tower block fiction, you know, that kind of thing, you know, flats and, you know, towers and all this sort of stuff. And that was kind of like the new Ireland, that idea. Now that's a very typical kind of idea, because that's a reaction against another Ireland, which is defined by the thatched cottage, and it's defined by DeValera's so-called dream speech of 1943.
And Peg
And all that. But the problem you see is with all that is that if you define yourself an Ireland that excludes all those things, you're not defining Ireland, because those things are there. You're driving down the road and there's a thatched cottage and there's someone living in it. So you're going to have to deal with that too, just as you have to deal with the flats.
Yes.
You know, and that's the trick. There's a kind of a fossilization of ideas that happens in a colonized culture, of images of the being, of the self, of the national home, and it takes an amazing amount of thought and reflection to free yourself in a way that you can negotiate all that stuff. And we didn't have that. We didn't have any, after Joyce and Beckett and those guys, and they were kind of, Beckett really was a very smart guy, but he didn't really provide a national literature. He left. You know, he became a French writer, in effect. All our great writers, of course, have abandoned the ship, you know. There were no philosophers. We don't have a tradition of philosophy in modern Ireland at all. I mean, there is going back, but nothing. So we were completely adrift without anybody describing what was happening. And then we imported all this kind of stuff from outside, you know, the television stuff and all this, and we just started replicating what they were doing and applying their models to our situation.
Yeah.
And this turned into bedlam, you know, and is bedlam now, and is about to become worse, because we're imagining that you know, we can import the world and that it will integrate to Ireland and that it'll be all cosy. It won't. It won't. It can't be, because we don't know who we are to begin with.
Yeah.
You know, and we didn't get time or didn't take time to reflect deeply enough on that question. Maybe we didn't have the talent, the resources to do it. But we weren't listening to anyone who was talking either.
Yeah.
And we were kind of, you know, we don't do. You know, I remember actually that speech of DeValera's, the 1943 speech, a very interesting speech in lots of ways. You know, it's known as the comely maidens dancing at the crossroads.
St. Patrick's Day, was it?
That's right, yeah. It was on the radio. Now, I've spoken about that, and I've written several long essays about that speech, because it's a very interesting speech. But you know, everybody knows it. If you say comely maidens dancing at the crossroads, they'll say, oh yeah, DeValera.
Contests of athletic youths.
Yeah. But he didn't use the word comely. He didn't mention dancing.
Yes.
And he didn't mention crossroads.
Okay.
That's a caricature. It's a complete caricature. And the reason is that I would actually, and my thesis has been that speech was used more than any other single instrument to propel Ireland out of its past.
Yes.
And into an unknowable future.
Yeah.
Because everything you wanted to say, if you wanted to dismiss anybody talking about Ireland, you just say, DeValera, yeah, comely maidens, more of that.
Dancing at the crossroads.
Next thing you'll have us all snagging turnips again.
Yeah.
You know, that's the logic. And I thought back, I remember actually back in 2008, after the collapse of the economy, I was down somewhere like Leakcliffe or somewhere like that, and I was doing a talk in a parish hall. And I just thought I'd try to test the temperature, like to see if the collapse of everything that they had embraced in rejection of DeValera and the dream speech, the Ireland, the Celtic Tiger, the collapse of the Celtic Tiger, which was the reaction to that. I was just interested, would that experience have chastened people? Would it have caused them to rethink? So I just put out a thing about DeValera and the dream speech. Not a bit of it. They were just as vehement against DeValera as they had been 10 years before. No lessons have been learned in that area at all. Because actually, when you break that speech down and when you look at it, he's essentially articulating a green view of Ireland before the word was invented.
Yeoman farmers.
Yeah.
Small property owners.
And aspirations tailored to the natural structure of man.
Yeah.
And the realization that actually, which is proved economically, that the relationship between wealth and happiness is more or less parallel until you get to the point of satisfying the natural basic needs of humanity. Yeah. And then they come completely out of sync altogether.
Yeah.
That it takes vastly more money to make you this little bit more happy.
There you go. Yeah.
You know, and that DeValera was saying this in the speech, essentially, in broad strokes.
Yeah.
And that's the green message. If you distill down I mean, it's become very corrupted now, but that idea.
Did you talk about a frugal comfort?
Frugal comfort,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Cozy homesteads, you know, firesides alive with the serenity of old age.
Yes.
You know,
it was a very human vision.
Beautiful. I mean, and described in Ireland. If you actually think, I think if you put that Ireland now, that vision, alongside Ireland now, which I see as being defined very darkly by 2 rooms.
Yeah.
And those 2 rooms are the childcare room, the creche, where children, little babies of 3 to 4 or 5 months are being dumped at 7 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the afternoon in the care of strangers. That's one room. The other room is where we'll all be dumped when our time comes, which is the nursing home.
There you go. Yeah.
And you have there a room where I've been in many a one, like visiting people, God help them. I've run out of them and I've had to, you know, take it to the bed after it.
Yeah, it's tough. You're right.
You know, that you see this room like, and all these people sitting around the perimeter of the room, the television blaring there, you know.
Yeah.
You know, some talk show, you know, Dahi and so on, and they're all cooking some thing or something, and it's all banter and nonsense. And these people are absolutely dead already, sitting around. No talk between them.
Yeah.
These are people like who loved Ireland, who worked all their lives to rear their families, to do their work. These are people who have like unbelievable kind of experiences to relate.
Yeah.
And they're just discarded like that. Like, you know, those people, when I was a child, like, they were the people who came across the fields to my grandmother's house. They were mostly elderly people. I suppose maybe everyone was elderly to me then, but they were. I mean, they were like 70s or thereabouts, a lot of them were like that. They were the kind of people you'd see sitting on the windowsill of a sunny day, you know?
Yeah.
With a walking stick like that, you know?
That's right.
And a word for everyone and a chat. And
yeah.
Like, they stayed at home.
Yeah.
And they were looked after at home.
Yeah.
Like, that's you know, we need to start reflecting, like, on all the things we were jeering and skitting at.
Yes.
And whether there was something in them or not. Because there was a hell of a lot more in them than we heard. And there was a hell of a lot more in what DeValera was talking about in that speech than anybody heard at the time. Because we didn't want to hear, because we needed... It's like me on the Elvis or Jesus thing. I didn't want to hear anymore. I'm Jesus, nice fella, but I'm gone.
Yeah.
You know, that was my attitude. And that's our attitude, you know. That's all very well, but who's going to pay for it? You know?
Yeah.
Where's the money going to come from?
Yeah.
Like, and you know, I think we need to revalue that. And that's not, I'm not saying this in any judgmental way. I'm as guilty as anybody for on all of these counts as well as seeing it. That's, I suppose, maybe that makes me all the more culpable. I see it and then I take part in, or I go along with, to some extent, what's happening. You know, that we're all sucked into this materialist kind of circus. And it's very hard to get out of it, you know. It's very hard to live your life differently.
Yeah. People who talk, which is a lot of people, who do very calmly about Ireland now as a post-Catholic, post-Christian society, like, that's about 1,500 years of history, which is a huge amount of history.
Yeah.
And I suppose the question I'm asking, because I know it's something you've thought about a lot, is how would you put this? You lobotomize a culture like this. Like, you take a chunk out of its brain. Because Catholicism is a part of our history, huge part of our history.
It is, yeah.
I mean, it gave us our vernacular literature originally. It helped to, it was midwife to it.
Yes.
So without Catholicism, have we a vision for being Irish?
No.
Now, I know some Protestant people would find that question offensive, but I'm not trying to do that.
No.
I'm not trying to be sectarian. It's just that the majority in this jurisdiction, at least, were Catholic.
Well, well, you see, I think there's that the question, Brendan, doesn't exclude Protestantism.
No,
in my
it
opinion.
doesn't.
It doesn't, you know, because, you know, they're yin and yang, and they're different elements. They're the same thing, you know, in a certain sense within the culture. I mean, that's not, or indeed, you know, Irish Catholicism is very particular because it has its roots in pagan Ireland in a very strong way. And you know, there's a lot of probably that kind of thing, that a lot of that has strayed into our thinking as well. But Catholicism is, yeah, it's in our bones. You know, and it doesn't matter what we call ourselves. That's the thing. You know, you can call yourself what you like, but you're still a Catholic.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as an ex-Catholic in Ireland. No such thing as an. You can declare yourself out. You can, you know, whatever you want to do. You know, resign.
That's interesting.
You can't. It's in your bone because the very basis of your thinking is Catholic. And that's a very profound form of thinking. I mean, you know, the Catholicism, you know, for all that we have railed against aspects of it and fought it, and you know, as the great John Keneally, poet from Castlereagh, wrote, there's a great beautiful line. He says, "I am a child who cried on the way to chapel." You know, we all did. You know, we all fought on the way to be baptized. You know, as it were, and we wailed when the water hit the forehead. But we are that. And when you go in the richness of Catholicism, Catholicism, I would say, is the only thing that stands philosophically in the world against tyranny, ultimately. It's the only thing that will save the world from ideology, which is a reduction of all of the great thoughts. Because, you know, for all that we have such a distorted view of it in Ireland, for somewhat understandable reasons, because it was, as we said, oversimplified. There's a deep richness there, and you know, now it's gone a little bit strange institutionally in recent times, but that inheritance doesn't exist anywhere else. Yeah. And the culture of our, you know, anthropology, and I'm talking about in the anthropological understandings, the ethical understandings of Catholicism, all of that, you know. I'm talking purely in a practical, sociological almost frame. But there's much deeper than that, which is the whole way of being with each other is actually predicated on this relationship with Christ, with the imagined figure of this man, Jesus. What your sense of what he would think of what you are, how you are conducting yourself. They're very profound ideas. And the only reason for railing against them is the old one. It's the one that we talked about. It's going in search of that other kind of freedom, which, you know, we have enough intelligence now, intelligence gathered, to tell us is fruitless. It's not going to lead to where we think it is. The anticipation of all those things will be better than the things themselves. They will all disappoint. As Augustine says, everything eventually turns to disgust. That's the human experience of these things. And then when you look around you, like, you know, you see all the different addictions, you know, and, you know, without going into being too graphic about them, like, but you can see them in Ireland now, in the landscape of Ireland. The change that has happened, and even in the shape of people in the last 20 years. These are all symptoms of this misunderstanding of the structure of the human person. So there's no escaping all this. And the way I put it is like, well, theoretically, you would say, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be Catholicism. You would say that, but we do need, first of all, some form of metaphysical understanding which unifies people. And it doesn't, you say, okay, well, it doesn't. Well, in theory, no, but in practice, yes, it does. There is nothing going to take the place of Catholicism now except nothing. Or nothingness. So we either rehabilitate it, reboot it, shake it down, look at the parts that are functional, which there are many. Well, the core of it is what it is, and that is absolutely critical to the understanding of the human person. It's not a question of a set of rules or guidelines. I think we need to find a way of revisiting that whole area. I'm sorry to say that I think that the leadership of the Church in Ireland has been very derelict and will not, in my opinion, be the guard that enables us to carry that out. I don't think that will happen. But it absolutely needs to happen. Something needs to happen like that we...
Why do you think that is? Is it peculiar to the Irish situation, or is it just a sort of a general thing now?
It's a general thing, but there are particular... For some reason, the Irish Church has seemed to constantly go for the administrator over the inspirer.
I get you, yeah.
You know, I don't know why that is. It just seems to be a way that it's safetyism, I suppose.
Here's the theory. Is it, because this is the stock I come from, although I know in Ireland it was an insult, but is it a peasant thing? To value the man who can make it happen?
Yeah, well, it is a bit. I suppose clientelist culture would yield such a, you know, and management. I mean,
who can just deliver,
yes.
You know, concrete results, verifiable, quantifiable. Is it? I remember you saying that we're practically incomprehensible without taking the famine into account.
Yes.
The terror of dislocation, of having no food, no house, the obsession with property. I wonder, is it an extension of that? Is it?
I believe all these things. See, I have long believed, Brendan, that actually our memories are far, far longer than our lives, and that they're far, far, far longer than we actually know. We remember things that we didn't even experience.
Wow, that's interesting.
You know, because I used to see it like, you know, I remember one night I wrote a book one time. It was actually, funny enough, about, you two were at the centre of it, but it was actually a story of Ireland, like how culture will transmogrify and still carry things from centuries before. Is that possible? That was the question. And I was using you two to tell the story. And I had a terrible time on the Late Late Show because Gay Byrne always wanted you to reduce everything to 3 points.
Okay.
Yeah, 3 points. That's all he wanted. And he wanted them on. He had them on the sheet in front of him, right?
Yes.
And he said, "You were saying that," and it was a terrible time because the panel didn't. Because the Gay's technique was, he would go to you first and give you every chance to vindicate yourself and to you know. But if you were not doing the business, he went to the panel. And he tried to go the panel against you, then you see. And that wasn't hard either. And if that didn't work, he went to the audience, and that did work, because he'd turn them on you, you see.
Yes.
He went up to a fella in the course of this, he says to him, he walked away, and he says, front row, he says to you, "Do you think we're talking a lot of nonsense?" He says, "I do." The answer was made. But what I was talking about, and I said this, I remember the one sentence I got out in that night. It was one of those nights that I was in the late, and I actually, you know, the mic was here, like, you know, and I was actually on the point. I was thinking, now if I could just clip that off, drop it on the floor, and skip it out the back,
yes,
they'd never miss me.
Yes,
because it was going really bad, because I wasn't getting it across, and what was in the book, because the book was it's big, you know, but. I remember once getting this sentence out, and I said, I says, I could see the famine in the way my uncles walked. And what I meant by that was, I watched an uncle of mine, like, who grew up on Mount Edward in the mountains up in Sligo, and I'd see him going down the street in Castlereagh, like, you know, my town, and I could see the diffidence in him.
Yes.
You know, in the way he walked. Like, he trying to make himself invisible.
Yes.
You know? Yeah, there's that play of Murphy's as well. There's a scene in that the Crucial Week where John Joe says he's out with his girlfriend, you know, and he's explaining about his parents, you know, and he said, because he's this new jacket, you see,
yes,
he can't wear it because they're in the ashes, like they're sitting at the fire, like, and he's going out enjoying himself, you know, and he's trying to explain it to the girlfriend. He says, but he says no. He says you don't understand. He says, you know, he says I do. No, he says you don't understand. He says. I can't enjoy this sports coat. Do you understand? And he used to take the coat off. He used to take it down from the stair and he carried it under his arm. He wouldn't put it on until he was outside the house.
Oh, wow.
Because it was an emblem of something. It was money, and it was aspiration, and it was vanity, and it was, or my father would call it conceit.
Yes.
You know, all those things, which are natural for young people.
Yeah.
But he said, I can't enjoy this sports coat. I said, I got it. I know it. I know. I was there. Like, and this is the thing. Like, we are carrying all these scars from those centuries ago. The fear of, and that's why we've become so materialistic.
And of course, we tend to forget the famine, in historical terms, is not that long ago.
Oh, it's very short. Well, when I started talking about this, you know, I really started about 1995 was the 150th anniversary. By the way, there's a particular individual, and he's right about this. We use the word famine as a shorthand. I do anyway.
Yes.
It wasn't a famine. It was a genocide.
Yeah.
That's my view. But that doesn't negate the word famine. It was like Pearse talks about this in the very first line of murder machine. He says when the English start a famine in one of their dependencies, they never do it for fun.
That's right, he does. I remember that.
Yeah. So that's the meaning I put on it. Like, so just to be
clear,
clear,
they're not a cruel people.
Yeah.
Everything they do has a point.
Has a point, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I'm not talking about the potato famine. I think that's a very insidious phrase, potato famine, because that tries to deflect the point. But anyway, that's another story. But what we're talking here is the way those scars can be inherited, can be handed on. And I think they are. I think that, the way we move, the way we feel, the way we laugh, the way we cry is all inherited. And the history is all in it, if you pay attention. It's like going back to that thing Murphy was talking about, the subtext. It's all there if you want to listen for it. And Murphy could listen. He had an extraordinary gift for that. He used to tell me, this is off the point, but it's really important, like how he used to write, Yeah. And I remember him describing to me one day, he was living in the house in Rathgar, and he had the windows, it was a sunny day in June, and pulled the curtains over all day long, and he put on Maria Callas on the record player, and he'd be drinking wine. He'd be sitting there, and that was the journey. He was going in, he was going down. And I remember he said to me, and John, he says, I heard, I was sitting there, and the children, laughter in the back garden, life. And all this, for what? Black marks on white paper. But that's what he did. That's the gift of the artist. Murphy was like a great, great artist, an extraordinary genius of Ireland. He never really broke it big anywhere outside, but he was the greatest playwright we've ever produced and can stand with the greatest, in my opinion. He got that. And he used to do that. I mean, Ivor Browne used to do it. He did an analysis once of one of his plays. I forget which one it was now. But the language in it was the one, I think, about the famine. I think it was where he actually said, this language doesn't exist.
Yeah.
He said, they're real words. He says, but nobody, he has found them somewhere. Like they're not invented.
Yes.
They're not imagined.
Yes.
They're actually reimagined.
Yeah.
So I certainly believe that, and when I was very friendly with Ivor Browne as well, and he always said this, that pain can be impressed in the body, by experience, by an accident, for example, in an ordinary context, but deeper, it can be carried for centuries in bodies. So I think that we have totally disregarded this aspect, and we talk about all this, we mock our own past and our own right to, as it were, as they now say, to own it. This kind of the mope, most oppressed people ever. This revisionist jeer.
Yeah.
I think that has done a lot of harm. I think in my lifetime the two greatest most damaging forces have been the Provisional IRA and the revisionist movement.
All right.
Because they've been a pincer movement which have squeezed the spirit of the Irish nation nearly out of existence.
See, I was going to ask you, this may be a fanciful thing on my part, but I was going to ask you, do you see a significance in the fact that Pearse and Connolly and those, they wore uniform? They took over identifiable points in the city, and they invited the most powerful army in the world, or certainly one of them, albeit distracted at the time.
Yes.
But obviously, as we see from history, not distracted enough to be able to deal with them when it got its focus on Dublin.
Yes.
Is it possible that something did slip in the War of Independence? No uniform, guerrilla tactics. Now, realistically, I don't know what else would have worked. But is it possible that there was a dark price, that we made a dark bargain there?
We did,
that Pearse wouldn't make?
No, I believe that's where the line is.
And do you remember he stopped the rising because of the civilian death rate?
Yes.
Well, it's insofar as he could.
As far as he could, at that stage, yes. But I do think that war is terrible. War is terrible, and terrible things are happening. Terrible things seem to be necessary in war. Let's put it like that.
Yeah.
And it takes a particular kind of a person to be engaged in those kind of things and not become corrupted by it. Because to kill another human being is a tremendous thing, is a terrible thing. But actually, once you've done it once, it gets easier, I gather. And that's the discipline that you need. It's like to be a soldier is a very particular thing.
Weren't the Black and Tans, in a sense, the tormented products of the killing fields in Flanders?
They were, yeah. They were totally distorted. As that was kind of like, the way that we now know about in the Vietnam War, and all of that, the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder or shock disorder. I mean, it's just this is central. But this happened in more recent times. It happened in the north, I think, in the 70s and 80s. It happened to the provisionals. They became completely corrupted in that same way. There was a great play, Defenders of the Faith, it was called, by Stuart Carlin, which is really a chilling play. I saw it in the Abbey one time. He wrote that love action. What is that thing on TV?
The crime drama.
Yes.
Love Hate.
Love Hate. Yeah, he wrote that. Brilliant guy.
Very gritty, very sharp.
Gritty, yeah.
Thing,
but this was really dark.
Yes.
You couldn't come out from that and not be in any doubt that the entire culture had been corrupted at such a profound level, because it was all true. That's the problem with violence, that's the worm of violence getting into a society. It can be lethal, and it takes people of great discipline and to be able to manage that and to know when it's enough and and I mean also to be risking yourself, as Pearse and these guys were. I mean that was part of the whole thing. They were staking their own lives, and they did, and they lost them. So it's a heavy thing, to consider. And it's a very interesting question. Could it ever happen again? Could it happen in our time? And maybe people will say that it can't happen now precisely because they've killed those passions in the spirit of man. I don't agree with that. I think that actually the opposite can happen. Life goes in cycles. Pearse always said this. There's nothing new. It just keeps the same thing. What was axiomatic, which is commonplace knowledge, and then forgotten, becomes known again. And I think that in the world generally, we have since World War II been on a journey of kind of softening everything. Rusty Reno was the editor of First Things, a friend of mine. He's written a book called Return of the Strong Gods, and he talks about disenchantment, that there was a disenchantment process that went through culture, Western culture, in the post-war period, in order precisely to destroy all those strong passions. He calls those the strong gods. The patriotism, idealism, all of these things that drive people to great things, And they were all and you can see that now, in particularly in men, around the place, they're softened, they're girlish.
And being mocked constantly in popular drama and advertisements and
that's right.
everything.
Well, that was all. It seems to be part of that. The whole kind of attack, the feminist attack on men, seems to be a part of that. And in Ireland, that's true. I mean, I know lots of young men now. I mean, it's very hard to talk to them because they don't know what you're talking about, and they get embarrassed if you start talking about anything of substance. They run away, or they try to turn the conversation into some kind of parody or pastiche or as they call it, the bant, But that can't last, you see. Yeah. Because that will create its own chaos, and the reaction to that then will be of the traditional kind. Unfortunately, that's inevitable. Because if we don't actually, pull ourselves together, somebody else will do it in our midst, and we'll be forced to actually either do it or die.
Yes. Dealing as I am now with the small numbers of young Catholics that are now there, and the numbers are small, I assure you. Well, that won't come as a surprise to you. A few thousand in the whole country, I'd say. By which I mean intentionally Catholics, because as you put it, it's rather harder to get away from than some people think. But I mean those who are intentionally, very many of them have rediscovered their faith. A lot of them have paid a high price for their faith, personally. Yes. They've come a journey and rediscovered it. As Eliot says, the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time.
Yes.
And a lot of them are there.
That's a familiar feeling.
Yeah. And a lot of them, interesting, you talked about the Latin Mass, a lot of them are going back to it because, of course, Benedict allowed that. He made it accessible and easy. A problem I'm having is that now I find I would have been regarded as how would you put it, a conservative by my contemporaries. And now this young crowd don't know what to make of me because I keep going on about Irish Catholicism. And they're suspicious of it. They see Ireland as having chucked the whole thing in. They don't trust Ireland, even though they're Irish. The Northerners particularly, because their families were so scarred originally, even though they're too young to remember it. But hear your point about memories being longer than a life, about the Troubles. And they don't want to hear about the Irish part of Catholicism. It's a very interesting development. People like me are fighting hard against that. I think it's a disastrous development. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. I think an Irishman is Catholic in an Irish way.
Yes.
I don't know, it's Billy Connolly said when he became a Buddhist, I think it was religion without whiskey. I can't imagine religion without whiskey, unless you're a pioneer, in which case whiskey is still somehow defining.
Yeah.
Religion without rain. Religion without the Irish landscape.
Yes.
Religion without Irish without Irish voices. Is there any point to my trying to take a stand on this? Is there any point, should I just be dealing with it, just saying, okay, fine, we'll be Catholics, I don't know, whatever, just Catholics, deracinated Catholics?
I think that if it works at all, that part will grow back. I think that at the moment there is an understandable reaction because they want to, in so many ways, that the indigenous institutional model of Catholicism has been disappointing and has been frustrating and indeed, and I would say that they might have certain views about the global picture as well at the moment, but I think that the figure of Ratzinger in the global sense has remained a hugely inspirational figure.
Yeah.
And will continue while he's in it and even afterwards. There isn't, that Catholic Irish thing is intangible. Undoubtedly it's there. Undoubtedly it's part of it. I mean, there is a kind of a school of thought that Catholicism was never really belonged in Ireland. I mean, I know that friends of mine who are sort of old-fashioned pagans, for example, have this view that it's an imported, Middle Eastern rabbinical Jewish. It's Abrahamic religion and so on, and that it never really fitted here. I don't agree with that. I think it was intrinsically part. Certainly, I mean, how long does something need to be part of a culture before it becomes inextricably part of it? I don't.
And the conversion seems to have been strangely smooth. There's no martyrology to speak of from the conversion. There's no great spilling of blood. No. Martyrs. It's curious in that it does seem to have taken root quite easily.
It does. I do think it. It suits. It did suit the personality of the Irish. Very many parts of it. I think that the young people are. They're reacting. You see, if you're a Catholic now and you're holding on to it, you're very much beleaguered in this culture. You're despised. You're looked at as a simpleton. Where in fact you're connected to the most profound understandings of reality that have been ever coined in this dimension. But that's not seen, because, as I said, if myself and you were to go on television on RTE tonight and I wanted to play the smart aleck and Miriam McCallan said, "It's you, Father." He said, "Well, just a simple question, Father. Do you believe in God?" And you say, "Yeah, I do, yeah." And I was then the kind of central casting atheist, say. And she goes, John Waters, what do you think? I says, I just said, no, I don't. Now, immediately, without uttering a word, only say, I know, or something like that, just laugh. I'm 1,000 times smarter than you are in this culture. I don't have to say anything more. I just have to sneer at everything you say. And just I saw something there. Somebody sent me a clip recently of some young gay fella, and he was doing all this thing, and it was terrible. I mean, most Catholics would regard it as deeply sacrilegious with a cross and doing the Our Father in a kind of a mimicky kind of voice. I wasn't offended by it. I just thought, he has no clue.
Yeah.
He has no clue. Yeah. He's to be pitied. But that's kind of that's the culture, and I know. I mean, I have relatives who are like that, and they're not all young. This is kind of worked its way up.
Oh no, indeed, yeah. And you get a fairer hearing from the young, nearly. Yeah.
Well, I actually would be very concerned. I mean, like Father, that we're now leaving people totally bereft at the end of their lives.
Yeah.
Because they're not sure about anything.
Yeah.
There's no solid basis for their belief in the culture, and there needs to be, you see. Because going back to what we're talking about, the effect of news and all that, if something isn't constantly being acknowledged, then it becomes suspect.
Yeah.
If you say, well, because you kind of say, God, I didn't hear anyone saying that for a while.
Yeah.
I wonder, is it not true anymore? Like, and I mean, I remember writing about this in the book called Beyond Consolation, in which I was talking about an interview with Nuala Whelan, one of my former colleagues in the Irish Times, when she was diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Yeah.
And she did this interview with Marion Finucane on the radio.
Famous interview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was a subsequent one with Seamus Heaney where he was asked questions about his belief, and he said, more or less, no. And it wasn't gone into.
Yeah.
And my point is, like, what concerned me was that if you leave things like that hanging, that has a terrible effect. And the result is that people that you think now would be not necessarily gospel greedy or daily mass goers or anything, but fairly solid in their faith, as it were. They're not at all. And they're elderly people. And they're terrified. And they're taking antidepressants in order to keep themselves half sane.
Yes.
And they're ending up in those terrible homes, and they're drugged up to their hairlines. And this is a shocking situation.
Yeah.
And I don't see anything happening from the hierarchy, from the church about this. They don't seem to be aware of it as a problem. We have a deep, profound spiritual crisis in Ireland, and it has all kinds of symptoms, and that's one of the ugliest and the most heartbreaking. Because it's not that they've lost their faith, it's that they haven't been given the tools they need to deal with the culture that's attacking their faith.
Do you remember that play, Philadelphia, Here I Come?
Yeah.
Do you remember where Gar says to the canon, it's Gar private, isn't it? It's the demon, if you like, the spirit, who's saying to the canon, don't you have anything to say, canon? Isn't it your job to translate?
Yeah.
And he definitely said that. Yeah. Isn't it your job to translate?
Yeah.
And it's a searing indictment of us.
It is.
Every time I hear it, I flinch, because I feel he's bang on.
Yeah. You see, it's not obvious.
Yeah.
God is not obvious if you take the bunker for granted. God only becomes obvious when you allow yourself into, you have to be able to access on a moment-to-moment basis the quality of wonder. That's the only way that you can know anything. The way I kind of would put it is that reality is, you see, you can actually try to get into the question of proving the validity of God or all this stuff. And that's kind of spurious. The question to begin with is, well, look where we are. Father Giussani does a thing in one of his books. That's the most amazing thing.
Can you just tell people who he is?
Father Giussani he was the founder of Communion Liberation, and he has a number of books which are really quite difficult reading, but brilliant, because it's hard to say what he does. It's not that he rewrites Christianity or anything like that. He doesn't in the slightest. But what he does is he places it in the context of the present moment. He speaks about the contemporaneity of Christ, and then he actually shows you what that requires for you to see. But he talks about this, and this is almost like what we were talking about about Pope Benedict's bunker and the idea of man having built this kind of place that he then convinced himself is the world. And that in order, what's the antidote to that then? Well, the antidote is obviously you have to find a way to look out of the bunker. He talked about opening the windows, Benedict did, open the windows and looking out at the mystery, so that you find that moment of resonance with your own heart and what you see beyond the bunker. But Giussani actually gave a very functional method for actually doing that. And that to me is the key to understanding this whole question. He said, imagine yourself being born. Imagine that at this moment, right here where we are, I am coming out of my mother's womb. He says, imagine it now. He says, what do I see? And what is my response? So I come out here, and I see movement, colour, being.
Yeah.
What is my response? Absolute astonishment. And then the second response, he says, I didn't do this. I didn't make myself.
Yeah.
That's the moment that we need to enter into in order to experience the wonder that we need to believe in God.
Yeah.
Because if we look around normatively, we're seeing only the bunker.
Mm-hmm.
But if we see it as we would have seen it for the first time, we feel that astonishment and we realize that actually we are in the midst of something unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable, even if we never knew what the word unbelievable meant.
Mm-hmm.
People say to me sometimes, well, come on, you're an intelligent man, these like fellow journalists or the likes. You can't really seriously mean to say, do you think the Son of God came down to earth and, lived here for 33 years and died on the cross and then rose again? I said, come on, come on. Yeah. And I said, yeah, I know what you mean, and I do know what you mean. But I'd say, that to me isn't nearly as astonishing as the fact that I'm here myself now, at this moment.
Yeah.
That to me is mind-blowing.
Yes.
If I wasn't, and if I had a mind that didn't exist, but that was somewhere to think, would I be in the slightest bit astonished by what I've done before, that the creator of the universe, I say, so this is the astonishing thing.
Yeah.
That we're here at all.
Yeah.
I'm here looking at you, and we're engaging in trying to understand each other and to talk to each other, and we've missed the whole game. This whole world that the bunker, it causes us to miss the whole game. That's what people need to be told. These older people, they need to go back to the basics. Yeah. And to be helped to actually solidify their feet on the ground so that they can actually stand before reality and stand before death. Yeah. Without fear. Yeah. It's not easy. I'm not, and again, Brendan, I'm not saying this, in some glib kind of, high moral groundery kind of way. I had an experience a couple of years ago where I actually believed I was going to die. And I went through terrible fear for a very short period. Now, to some extent, it was to do with the condition, which was a kind of it was a viral thing that I had, and it attacked my nervous system. Yeah. So it probably turned me to jelly in a certain, almost literal sense. But nevertheless, I felt terror. And when I identified the terror, I wrote an article in First Thing. It was the terror of goodbye, the terror of losing all the love that I had in this world, all the people that I loved and loved me. I couldn't bear the thought of that. That was the only thing. It wasn't fear of the afterlife or fear of judgment or fear of anything. It was the fear of actually having to say goodbye to people. Yes. And people are flinching away from that, and I understand that. But we do need to help them and help ourselves in so doing to find their feet again in this absolute bog of a culture. Yeah. Because otherwise we will all die roaring.
Oh, very good. That may stay with me. That's good. Yeah, that's good. We've talked about 1916. We've talked about idealism. We've talked about all of these impossible things, as Pearse said, deeming them alone worth the toil. He dedicated his life to the impossible.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And we're talking about faith. Benedict, whom you clearly admire, he's very absorbed, as you know, in this whole thing of beauty, and that beauty will lead us to God. Yes. And that indeed, without beauty in our worship, in our lives, that it becomes hard. It becomes hard to reach God. It becomes hard for us to visualize God. Music. Yes. Do you see a special potential in music? Because I know you've written about it, and I know it's a big part of your life. I used to teach, and second level, what I was constantly struck by was the part that music played in the lives of the boys I taught. Many of them were not musicians, they didn't play, but they were engrossed in music. It was a language they spoke confidently. Can you say anything to that? Is there a way forward for us in music?
Oh, I think there has to be. The music is vital. It's as vital as food and drink, I think, because it is a language of the other, the language of the unknowable. And it's a language that comes from within us that is, is not, like conventional languages, but it goes deeper. I'm not educated in classical music or whatever. I mean, but I have certain experiences, and I'm not a musician, but I have written songs, and I play very badly a number of instruments, purely for my own annoyance. But I think it's vital. Just to take it into Benedict immediately, because I do think he had an extraordinary understanding of all this. I remember about 2 years ago, after I had been very ill for about 6 months with this viral thing, and that had really kind of paralyzed my face and left me deaf in my left ear.
Wow, okay.
So I couldn't listen to music anymore, and very much, and I still can't, because there's a condition in my ear called hyperacusis that it amplifies the vibration but not the noise, not the sound. So it's a very distressing kind of thing. But we were in Oxford, myself and my wife. I was at a conference, and we went to a Latin Mass there in one of the churches. I think it's there all the time, and I hadn't been at one for a long time. And you know, the music started, and like I could feel something rising in me, you know. And then the procession started, you know. I used to sing these hymns, these pieces when I was a child, you know. Dies Irae and Agnus Dei and Sanctus and all this, and we did the lot. So then the procession came down, and there was, like, you know, about a dozen priests and 3 dozen altar boys, and they're coming in. The priest in the front, like, and he was doing the holy water, and he was lashing it out, like, and you know. And as it came to me, I was there. The music was on, and the holy water caught me full on the face, just on the paralyzed part of my face, and I burst into tears. And I literally sobbed uncontrollably for about 5 minutes.
Wow. And
I was thinking about it. I couldn't articulate to you even now what that was like. But I think it had something to do with the idea of being home.
Yeah.
You know, after all the journey, or much of the journey, that this is home. This is where I began. And this is real, this is concrete, this is true. And music has always had that kind of effect on me. It really moves me profoundly. And not just, you know, the soaring kind of classical things, which can do that. I mean, and even though, as I say, I'm not educated in that area. Rock and roll was my foundational music, and also Irish traditional music. I love Irish traditional music, and that has the same power in different ways to do
really?
It. Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are no musics that I've ever heard that, you know, can match, you know, the old Dedanan in full flight. Like, it's just beyond belief. Yeah, because the sense of the personality, yes, like with the humour, the sense of that erupts in that music, is just such. You know, that's again. You know, I didn't mention that when we were talking about the personality of Ireland. But I mean, you can't talk about the personality of Ireland without the music, because that is, you know, the true note.
The sean-nós and the Gaeltacht, the endless verses.
yes, that's right. I remember Vincent Brown once doing a speech about that at an event, and he was calling for set aside for sean-nós singers, you know, that they'd be paid not to sing, but that was a joke. No, it's utterly tremendous music. But you see, Ratzinger, it's very interesting. About 10 years ago, I curated an exhibition in Rimini in Italy, as part of the meeting of Rimini, which is a massive thing organised by Communion Liberation, and they asked me to do this about rock and roll, and it was called Rock and Roll as a Quest for the Infinite, which I think is a very serious. Yes. But I was using it as my kind of sparring partner was the figure of Ratzinger, because he had actually spoken about rock and roll in quite critical terms. Yeah. And about the kind of that it breaks us down into the base instincts, and it is about the ego, that it removes us from the possibility of the beauty. Like his thing about beauty is really so absolutely essential for us to understand, that the beauty as a sign of order that is unknowable, that we must see this clue and follow it. This is the thing, you know, that when we feel that, we must trust that feeling. Of the mysteries singing to us. Yes. And the joy that we feel, unaccountable joy that we feel in hearing a piece of music, or you know, that it just carries us away out of ourselves, and so he has, you know, a profound understanding. But my case was really with the exhibition then was to say to Ratzinger, there's more to this as well that you haven't seen, and I wanted to try and explain it, because that is really so true, you know. There are some extraordinary artists, like I think David Bowie was an amazing artist, and he's, you know, a song like Heroes, what it can actually sum up about the human spirit, like it's so paradoxical and yet ironic and yet real and true, you know. And like Lou Reed does a version of John Lennon's song Jealous Guy, which will just put the hair standing on your head, like, I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's terrifying because he actually is that character.
Whoa. He
is the character, and he is every move, every twitch is there, you know. It's unearthly, you know. So the thesis of this exhibition was that rock and roll in modern society was a kind of a paradoxical instrument, a kind of a Trojan horse for the consciousness of greater things. And it was one of the few ways left by which these things could enter the city without being stopped at the gates and turned back, you know.
Okay.
That the musician, whether it somebody I say like Lennon or Bowie or Lou Reed or whatever, that there's a strange process like that.
Yeah.
You know, they might have a guitar in the hotel bedroom, and they take it out after concert or first thing in the morning or in the afternoon, and they start to write a song out of something, and the feeling is real there, and they translate that into words and music. And then that song is processed, it's recorded in the studio, and it's fed through like a multiplicity of wires, not just literal wires, but all kinds of figurative wires of public relations and advertising and hype and narcissism and you name it, you know. And then this artist goes on the stage to sing, and he's actually posing. He's behind something that is misleading, because he's this narcissist, this egomaniac. But the song is him in the room expressing the innermost feeling, and it's still there. And that translates through all the wires to the teenager in their hotel bedroom receiving this. And a bit like the idea of the humour that it communicates in Irish culture, in the Irish personality, the spark is created, is generated, and that feeling is generated in their heart as well.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the great artists, if you look at them, that's what they've been doing. You know, they don't call it that. You know, I remember talking to Bono of U2. I think they've got a bit off the rails, but they did understand this. Bono did understand this, does understand it. You know, that you can't really talk about this too much because it's not supposed to be talked about. But ultimately, the music, it's a powerful thing, that music. And that's actually the hardest case to make, in a way, rock and roll. It's the hardest case to make in this because it's supposed to be the devil's music. That's an ironic appellation. Like, it's not at all. It's about the spirit of man also. I mean, there are a lot of stupid things as well, obviously, but it has that potential and still has and could actually renew itself, although it's in a kind of a plateau period now. So that is always, I mean, that music moved me in the beginning, you know, that it suggested that things were possible. I mean, it seduced me into the wrong idea of freedom as well. But it also educated me to come back, because when you listen to some of these guys, they go through those journeys pretty quickly, and they can tell you, you know, how it doesn't work. And that was true of Bowie. If you look at the figure of Bowie, think about him, like, he was a wreck to begin with, like, an absolute maniac.
Yeah.
And then he became this, like, adult, this extraordinarily responsible adult who would just, the most shimmering performances I've seen, like, of anybody. There's an amazing performance, which is online, of himself and Lou Reed singing Waiting for the Man, which is a song about waiting for a drug pusher. But it's like a novel in a song, like. And you want to, it's just mind-blowing. Like, the way they can reenact the story, and they without any pretense or affectation or anything, just, and the irony and the fun between them, and the knowingness and the language, it's just amazing. And you know, and then, if you go back to 1992, there's an amazing moment, if people want to look at it, when at the concert for Freddie Mercury in Wembley Stadium, And this clip is taken out of all the film, but it's there on YouTube if you want to put it in. David Bowie, Our Father. He does his set and he gets on his knees and he says the Our Father on stage in front of 120, 130,000 people, live to the world.
Crikey.
Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it.
I bet they don't.
It's the most amazing moment. And you can see it. You can see it in his demeanour that he's... I described it in an article about for First Things. Like I just described it like almost like in slow motion, you know, what he's doing. You can see his process. Because at one point, somebody starts at kind of a taunt. There's a jeer from the crowd. And you think, that if that was me, I would go louder.
Yeah.
He goes softer.
Yeah.
Because he's so, like, and it stops. He stops it right there. He just goes softer.
Yeah.
Hallowed be thy name.
Yeah.
And you can see it as he's getting to the end. He said, I'm getting away with it. I'm getting away with it. I'm doing it. I'm here. I'm showing my true heart to the world. And I'm actually succeeding.
Is that a Pádraig Pearse moment?
It is, yeah. Well, it is.
And he's equally uncomfortable.
In that idiom, it is
in
that idiom, yeah, it is a similar thing. And this is the amazing hidden part of rock and roll, by the way, because the packaging is all ideology.
Yeah.
But the heart is not. You can't write songs of that quality and not be real.
So are you basically saying that and I know how infuriating it is, by the way, when an interviewer says, so you're saying, you're really saying.
So what you're saying is...
But is the artist a beautiful trapped animal being shown by curmudgeonly zookeepers who don't understand him or unworthy of him, but who have him in their clutches?
That can be part of it, but it's a necessary part as well, actually, paradoxically, because you know, the artist can't do what is necessary.
He's not a businessman.
No, or to communicate, because you need all those processes.
Yeah.
And so, but you need to fight. And I mean, rock and roll is studded with kind of experiences of that collision, like Lennon and the Beatles, you know, and that whole moment, and just walking away from it all, and Peter Green, like giving all his money to charity, and just you know, walking into Oxfam and saying how much will it take to fix Biafra or whatever it was, and just writing the check and walking out. You know, like these were pure hearts, and they're still there. You know, it's just that it can become, you know, the packaging comes to be seen as the thing.
Now you're talking there again about authenticity. We had talked about that earlier with regard to the humility, which is really realism before God, before the mystery, all of that. I gather you have reservations about Christian rock or Christian...
Oh, I do, yeah, I do. I think it's almost like the ultimate oxymoron in a strange kind of way.
Yes.
Because it just doesn't work. And I think it's because it makes everything too explicit, you know? I mean, that's the thing that I feel, even... I don't like talking about religion or faith or those things for that reason, because they short-circuit into a misunderstanding.
Don't communion and liberation prefer to just refer to the mystery?
The mystery, yeah.
Rather than going on about God?
Well, they do, but they do talk about Christ. They do talk about Christ.
Sure,
but yeah, they talk about the mystery, because I think that they understand that problem, but they cannot, within that as well, you can get the same syndrome where the possibilities are killed by a kind of a simplistic, sentimental or superficial statement of something that is not proven, in the sense that we're talking about, we're trying to get to something.
I know.
And you can kill it by reaching the answer without the question.
And you end up with just sentiment.
Yes. Yeah. And that's something that I'm wary of. You see, but to be honest with you, like in this culture, it doesn't really matter whether you succeed or fail in expressing it, because you get hammered anyway, and they'll start hammering you from the minute you open your mouth. So it doesn't matter how well you say something. Yes. And I think the artist, this is very visible in rock and roll. The artist's job is to articulate the first cry of man. At that moment that Giussani described as, imagine you have just been born, because then the cry is of exhilaration and fear and anticipation and wonder. And that's something that in the bunker, maybe in a perfect world, we could all do that all the time. Maybe that's their aspiration as a species, is to be able to speak that. But if you're in the bunker, you say the things the bunker gives you generally, and the artist goes against that.
Yeah.
And that's why you can recognise the talent, the genius immediately. You can distinguish the genius.
So there's a prophetic quality to the artist.
Oh yeah, very, very sure.
And involved in that, then the possibility of Golgotha, of the crucifixion.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's almost. It's almost a given.
Yeah.
It's almost a given. I mean, like. Yeah, because I mean, like any artist, I mean, Dylan will be, is 80 now,
but he's done well to get there.
He's done well to get there.
The life is hard on them.
And he's a converted Christian.
Yes.
You know, so he takes all this very seriously. I mean, he has said that he roots everything he writes in the Bible.
Yeah.
And that nothing could be further from that to the kind of, let's say, the hot press view of rock and roll, which despises all that.
Yeah.
But these guys, these are the real deal.
Yeah.
Bowie and Dylan, John Lennon, who spent all his life trying to find the meaning of God.
They live it.
They live it, yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful statement he made in the first line of God, that song. God is a concept by which we measure our pain.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful understanding of you know, it doesn't rule out anything.
Yeah.
You see, the thing is, there's a tendency in our culture to reduce. Once you start to trade only in words, you reduce things out of existence. I'll give you an example. I mean, Stephen Hawking at one point wrote quite openly about the question of God, the possibility of God. And then he did this book where he kind of rejected the same idea. And I remember all the headlines in the papers were the same. Everywhere in the world. It was, Hawking says, God was not necessary for the creation of the world. And everybody says, there you are now. He's a brilliant scientist and you're only an idiot. That's the, right?
Yeah.
Now, just take that, just stop and look at that sentence. What does it mean? God was not necessary for the creation of the world. God. Who is God? So God is some figure who was not responsible for the creation of, right. So God exists, but he wasn't responsible for the creation of the world. So God exists, wasn't responsible for the creation of the world, but the world was created. By whom? Not by God. Okay, fine. So somebody else created the world. Tell you what, maybe we could call that person that created the world God. Maybe his name. Maybe he's not. Maybe
we can all go home.
Yeah. So what I'm saying, the point is, it's a meaningless statement.
Yes, yes.
And this is what words does to you.
Yes.
Words can't, you know, it's like Murphy says, you know, words are not the meaning.
Yeah.
It's the meaning is the subtext. You know. Yeah, but what's your name like? You know.
Yeah.
Like that's what it comes down to. And so many of these questions, you know, these artists, like they searched and searched and searched. It's a real symptom of an artist. I don't believe that it's possible to be an artist and to close down questions in the way that our culture insists now. And the opposite is happening in our culture, because actually to be an artist in our culture now, it seems you have to be a secular atheist to be accepted. It's almost unthinkable. You don't, tell me the name of a poet, a musician, artist who is known to be a believer.
Yes. Or
even an explorer. Yeah. It's almost unheard of. And that's bunker stuff, you see.
Yeah.
They're products of the bunker. They're artists of the bunker.
Yeah.
But artists not of the bunker.
Okay, like Stalin's tame artists, the socialist realist artists who
very similar.
Churn them out.
Much closer than they would like to admit.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's very
so like we're in a bad way for real, genuine, true explorations. And you know, I think you know, it's what we have is a kind of an anti-art. You know, it's a reaction against stuff that came before, or a replication, or a parody, or a pastiche. But it's not the real thing.
Yes.
So music is, I think, one of the codes by which we can transcend, in our own terms, our own self-created context and edifices and thought processes. And it's really important, I think, for people that they continue to access it, but that they not necessarily become educated, but to follow the line of thinking of these artists and the line of feeling, because they bring us to places that we wouldn't. We might be there, but they give us some concrete realization that it is real. I think that's part of what Benedict was talking about, that beauty is a sign of that order.
Yeah.
And that happens in music, like, because the world is such an extraordinary place that, you know, you would want to be perverse to want to explain it away by just saying it's a random, you know, collision of atoms.
Does anyone really believe that?
I don't think they can, you know. And I mean, that's beauty is the answer to that.
Yeah.
And beauty is an order, but it is the opposite of order in another sense, because order, more and more, is what man imposes on the world. And that's very much not beautiful. And it is denying the reality of the human journey and the human spirit and the human heart. And I think that these things have to be rediscovered in culture if there's to be a future.
Yeah.
We don't have a future without that journey being made in public. You see, a lot of the whole purpose of leaders and of any kind, I think, whether they be political or cultural or spiritual, is their whole purpose should be to dramatize these questions and make them visible to people so that people can recognize the question that's in their own heart and see it played out.
That brings me to my second last question, because we've talked about the price that the political idealist pays. He dies, in one way or another.
Yes.
He suffers. The artist suffers. Now you're talking about the religious leader as, if you like, the teller of the story. But you have made the mistake of telling Ireland, a notoriously ungrateful country, of telling Ireland its own story for years, right? And you have paid a price. And again, I'm not trying to flatter you here. I'm sure your opponents would acknowledge that.
Yes.
You know, your critics would acknowledge that. I know this isn't a fair question, but who's John Waters now, at this stage in your journey? I don't really don't know if I have the capacity to answer it. I think with regard to your thing about the price and all that, I mean, but I've come to terms with that on the basis that, you know, if you speak the truth, and I don't mean that in any grandiose way, I just speak. No, sure.
I just speak what I know, what I see, what I feel, what I intuit. And if I might be wrong, but it's still the truth, because it's the best I can come up with, and somebody can correct it in the future or whatever. But again, it's part of that bunker mystery thing, that on the one hand I feel that there's a part of me that still wants to be accepted. You know, we're talking about all that. You know, there's a part of me that misses the kind of respect of the culture.
The Esthona.
Yeah. But equally, I actually at the same time know that if I had that at this moment, given the way things are, I would be absolutely a fraud. So the price of doing what I have to do is to be as I am. And therefore that is what I am now. And I'm actually happier in that situation than I thought I ever could be. You know, my life is happy now. I'm married. We have a lovely family situation, an extended family. There's a lot of support, a lot of understanding, a lot of fellow feeling. I'm not lost in the way that I might have been not that long ago. You know, 25 years ago.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You know, or I don't know if I could survive now. Things have accelerated and exacerbated to such an extent. I don't think I could survive now what I'm going through if I was living the life I was living then.
Okay.
As a kind of a solitary man, as it were, you know. But I mean, I'm quite heartbroken, really, about what's happening in Ireland. And I look at little children, like, and you know. We have a few children in our family, and little ones, you know, and their eyes are so full of hope and trusting. It breaks your heart that you cannot promise them anything anymore. You can't give them anything anymore, for sure. You can't bequeath them anything, because it'll be corrupted, maybe, unless we can somehow offset or head off what's happening. So I'm concerned about all that. I'm distressed by that. But I'm also surer than I've ever been, that this is what I was put here for. You know, there's no other thing that I can do. I can't not do it. Anything I do because I cannot not do it. I wish I could.
Yeah.
I try to talk myself out of it.
Yeah.
I try and duck and dive.
Yeah.
It always comes back and says no. That's happened to me numerous times in my life, Brendan, that I was about to change direction artistically or whatever. I was writing plays for a while. I wanted to go in to do that. And I got the message. So whatever this is, God, he gives me kind of a nudge first, you see?
Yeah.
And if I don't take heed, he'll give it a slap on the ear.
Yes.
Right? You know? And then he headbutts me, you know?
Very Irish.
and that meant that I've always had to go back to the path.
Yes.
The path that I was on.
Yeah.
It's not the straight path, but it's continuous.
Is this one of the bad roads that you want back?
Well, actually, it is probably. I think there is a connection, all right, because you know the road is such an iconic concept in human mythology. Yeah. You know that I think that's why. I mean, Jack Kerouac. You know.
Yes, on the road. Yeah.
That's why. That's not. It's not. You know, beat. You know, it's beatify. That's what it means.
Yes.
That's actually what he said.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from. The beat generation.
Wow.
That's what it means.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. Like this is what I say. You see, it's so disguised, you know.
Yeah.
Rock and roll is actually because it comes from gospel music. You see.
Yeah.
Partially.
Yeah.
Couldn't be otherwise. Negro spirituals from the blues, the cry of the slave.
Yes.
You know, the Irish dying, the starving Irish on the boats with the folk songs which Bob Dylan plundered and turned into modern gems. You know, I mean it. With reverence, he plundered.
Yes.
With great reverence, I say it.
Yeah.
But this is from the cry of the human heart at its most essential basis. Like it's trying to find a sound that I think it was Paul Morley, the British writer, said that the singer, like someone like Van Morrison, is when he sings and tries to break the words apart, he is searching for the voice of God. That's what it is. That's what it is. All the other stuff is all just noise. Yeah. That's what it is. There's nothing else that draws people than that. It's not the glamour. These are all just, you know, this is misdirection. The hype, you know, it is this process of beatification. And the road is part of that, you know, and this is the journey that we're on. That's what it means. Yes. That it's freedom. Yeah. That's what Kerouac was saying. That you know, the freedom we seek is the road that we're on.
Doesn't Pearse use the phrase "on road Sharon"? The road before me, to the deed I shall do, to the death I shall die.
That's it.
Yeah. Last question. I know it's going to sound whimsical, but there is a point to it. Okay. You're a newly minted Irish bishop. You've just been consecrated. The oils aren't even dry.
Huh.
First 3 decisions.
Oh boy. I think the first thing I would do is establish some kind of mission to re-evangelize Ireland in a particular way into the reasonable basis of the Christian faith, and to show them that to show the people that what we've been saying, that what blocks people from faith in God is not God. It's all the stuff that we've built that blocks our vision of reality. I kind of often say, you know, that I was lucky in a way, Brendan, to be born in a small town, because outside in the street, and particularly when we were growing up, like in a sense, there was a cafe up there, the Roma Cafe, and there was a jukebox, and there was, you know, it was like in a certain sense, it was like any city street. It's like the street out in Westport there. And the thing about that, when you're on a city street, you're told where to go. There's arrows pointing, there's lines, you know, you're directed this way, that way, left, right, you know, cross, don't cross, whatever. When I went out my back door, I was basically in the wilderness, because all the gardens were kind of run into one, a commonage, and there was a river that went through, the river, a suck went through the back of our houses. We live in both worlds, and we have to learn the language of both. And it goes back to what I said about Ivor Brown, it's not either or, it's both and. Yeah. So I would set up some kind of, I don't like words commission, but I would actually try to recruit the most brilliant in the sense, I mean the absolute mysterious sense of brilliance. Yeah. To try and find ways to start disseminating this idea.
And the second?
Well, I would actually restore the Latin Mass to
There we go.
the centre, if I could. If I had
I
the
know
power.
some young Catholics who are going to beatify you on the spot for that.
No, because that is the beauty. That is the beauty. That is the wonder. That is the mystery all there. That is the dramatization of the mystery, but it is also the mystery.
Yeah.
And do you want another one? I don't know.
Yeah.
I just think that the Catholic Church needs to create a different mentality, a different view of itself. That it's not just bishops are not just managers, they're not executives, like they're actually custodians of the culture. And that they have a responsibility to, at the most fundamental level, to nourish our understanding of our own.
But the office
structure.
is prophetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a prophetic office.
It is,
Yeah.
But it explains. I remember actually hearing that phrase, actually. This is how, one of the moments that when I was on my journey back, I heard an interview with Ratzinger, or it was a translation, he wasn't speaking in English, and all I can remember is a snatch of one sentence. And I remember I could see the commas in the sentence. There's only 5 words I remember. The church, and I could see the comma, expert in humanity.
Yeah.
Another comma, and I don't know what was after.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yes.
That's not all it is, obviously.
No, but
it is that.
Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary resource.
Yeah.
And never in our lives, never our history, have we needed that resource so desperately as we need it now.
Yeah.
So I would say that that would be one of my most urgent tasks, is to say to, if I was Archbishop of Dublin or Armagh or anything, I would say, we really have to claim this role again. We have to lay claim to it. And I'll tell you something, Father, I believe that young people would respond to such a call.
Yeah.
They're crying out, many of them, for some kind of, something that will unite all these things. It's not that I'm saying is not, it is never my intention in saying these things to trendify or hippify things. I don't have any time for that.
Yeah.
I understand the pop culture, rock culture, very strong, very well. But I'm not necessarily part of it. I never fitted into it. I was never a ligger, you know. I just watch it and I'm interested and I'm curious. And I don't think that it's all that different to being a priest or a bishop. You know what I mean? It sounds a horrendous thing to say.
No.
But they're very close.
Yes.
The searching for the truth.
Yes.
They're the same thing. And I think that those barriers need to be broken down, not by becoming hyper and saying, whatever you're having yourself, you know. I'm not interested in that. That's where it's going wrong now.
Yeah.
Because the anthropological dimensions of the Church's teaching, as I said, are vital, not because of grey-bearded men handing down tablets of stone, but because all of these things are written in the structure of the species and of the individual human heart. And so, you know, that needs to be understood. But I think that's the lesson of rock and roll, funnily enough, I mean, as well. I mean, at the end of the day, the people who survived, they were the longest, were people like Leonard Cohen and Dylan and these guys who understood these questions at a profound level. The ones who didn't died at 27, and that's why.
Wow. Yeah. John Waters, I don't know about you, but I could sit here all evening.
Me too,
listening
I'll
to
tell
this. It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and it certainly has not been work, not for me anyway.
Thank you.
And we are so grateful. Thank you. Thank you for so generously sharing your thoughts. And we look forward perhaps even to further conversations down the line. Please,
I'd love to do that. Thank you very much.
Take care, John, and God bless.
God bless.